Chapter 1. A Visitor in the Fog. It was in the bleak November of '89 that I once more found myself domiciled at Baker Street, having returned from a brief sojourn in the country where I had been attending to the convalescence of a former military patient. The London air, heavy with soot and the perpetual damp of that season, pressed down upon the gaslit streets like a shroud. Yet as I crossed the familiar threshold of 221B, the faint crackle of the fire and the unmistakable scent of Holmes's Turkish tobacco lent the room that peculiar comfort only found in long companionship. My friend was at his usual post, stretched languidly upon the settee, violin in hand, his keen grey eyes fixed not on the strings, but upon some invisible point in the air before him. On the table beside him lay the remains of a modest breakfast, an assortment of newspaper clippings, and an envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand. "You perceive, Watson," he said without looking up, "that our visitor is a gentleman of some refinement but limited means, recently come from the north of England and in considerable distress." "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed, hanging up my hat. "Have you already seen him?" "Not yet," he replied, allowing the faintest smile to play at the corners of his lips. "But I have read the evidence, which you, I presume, have not." He nodded toward the envelope. I took it up. It was of good quality paper, yet the edges were smudged and slightly frayed as if it had been handled with nervous haste. The postmark read, Durham. Inside was a brief note written in a firm, if somewhat tremulous, hand. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you will grant me a consultation at your earliest convenience. I am at the Langham Hotel and in urgent need of your assistance regarding a matter of life and honor. Yours sincerely, Arthur Penhaligon. Holmes placed the violin upon the sofa and rose with that cat-like grace which always accompanied his moments of decision. Penhaligon, he mused. Cornish name. Not common in the north. The man is likely of gentle birth, recently relocated for reasons not wholly voluntary. Note the pressure on the paper. See how it deepens near the salutation. Guilt or desperation, my dear Watson. The ink, however, is recent. We may expect him within the hour." I had long since learned to refrain from questioning the path by which Holmes's deductions travelled, though I often marvelled at the ease with which he crossed gulfs of inference that to ordinary mortals would seem unbridgeable. We had scarcely resumed our seats when the sound of approaching footsteps ascended the stair, followed by a hesitating knock. "Enter!" Holmes called sharply. A tall, fair-haired gentleman stepped across the threshold. His attire was sober but of excellent cut. A dark frock coat, slightly travel-stained, and a gloved hand that trembled as he removed his hat. His eyes, a striking shade of grey, moved rapidly from Holmes to myself, then to the cluttered interior of the sitting-room as though measuring the worth of the mind that might inhabit it. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he began. "I am. This is my friend and associate, Dr. Watson. Pray be seated, Mr. Penhaligon. You are from Durham, I perceive." The visitor's astonishment was almost comic. "Why, yes, sir. But how could you possibly know that? The red clay upon your boots is of a kind peculiar to the banks of the Wear, and the slight burr in your speech, though faint, betrays a northern origin. But these are trifles. Let us to your difficulty." Mr. Penhaligon sat, clasping his gloved hands together as though steadying himself. "It is, Mr. Holmes, a matter most grave, one that has cost me sleep and may soon cost a man his life." He paused, then in a voice laden with suppressed agitation, continued, "I have come to you regarding the strange and terrible fate of my late employer, Sir Algernon Fiske of Ravensshade Hall." At the mention of the name, Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ravensshade Hall, near Bishop Auckland, if I recall correctly. A rather desolate estate." "Indeed, sir. I was until last month in Sir Algernon's service, acting as his secretary and assistant. The circumstances of his death, well, they are not as they appear. The authorities have ruled it a natural passing, but I am convinced it was murder." "Murder, you say?" Holmes leaned forward, fingertips pressed together. You are aware of the gravity of such an accusation. I am, and I make it with a full sense of the peril to my own reputation, Penhaligon replied. Sir Algernon was found dead in his study 3 weeks ago. No mark of violence, no sign of forced entry. Yet on the night of his death I heard... His voice faltered. I heard the sound of the bell that rang for the servants, though none were in attendance, and when I entered the room I found the bell rope swaying gently. Though the air was perfectly still, Sir Algernon lay at his desk, his face. He stopped again, visibly shaken. Watson's medical instincts compelled him forward. A seizure, perhaps, or apoplexy. The local physician said as much, but I know what I saw. There was someone else in that room, though unseen. The following morning the butler, an old man named Graves, was gone, vanished without a word or trace. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Graves, you say? How long had he been in service? More than 30 years. A faithful servant, or so everyone believed. But in the days before Sir Algernon's death I observed a change in him. Furtive glances, muttered conversations with no one, and once I could swear the faint sound of whispering from behind the closed pantry door. Holmes rose and began to pace, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. And the police accepted this convenient disappearance without question. They assumed the old man, distraught by his master's death, fled the hall. I, however, cannot accept that. There is something foul beneath the surface, something I dare not face alone. The clock upon the mantel struck noon, its tone clear in the hush that followed. Holmes halted beside the window, gazing out into the drifting fog. You have done wisely to come to me, Mr. Penhaligon. I shall undertake your case. Watson, I trust your practice can spare you a few days. With pleasure, I answered, feeling that familiar thrill which accompanied every new venture into mystery. Excellent. We shall take the night train to Durham, Holmes said briskly. In the meantime, Mr. Penhaligon, you will oblige me by writing down every recollection of that evening, however trivial it may seem. The truth, as I have often remarked, hides in the corners others overlook. Penhaligon bowed gratefully. You have lifted a weight from my heart, Mr. Holmes. If justice can still be served, I can face the rest. When he had gone, Holmes turned to me with that air of suppressed excitement I knew so well. Watson, he murmured, there is something singular in this affair. A death without violence, a servant who vanishes, and a bell that rings of its own accord. All excellent, my dear fellow, most excellent. I suspect this case will test not only our reason, but our nerve. And as the fog thickened beyond the window and the sound of distant hooves echoed through Baker Street, I knew instinctively that we stood upon the threshold of one of the strangest adventures of our long association. Chapter 2. The Bell at Ravenshade Hall. The evening mists had gathered their accustomed garrison along the thoroughfares when we quitted Baker Street for Euston. It has ever been my fancy that London, like some monstrous cephalopod, draws back its tentacles of traffic at nightfall, only to send them forth again with renewed appetite at dawn. And never did the creature seem more alive to me than as our hansom picked its way through glistening cobbles and the wavering halos of gas lamps. Holmes, muffled to the chin in his long ulster, spoke little, his eyes lowered and his mouth compressed in that straight line I had observed upon the threshold of many singular enterprises. In the waiting room, our client, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, stood guard over a modest leather valise and a folded umbrella whose whalebone ribs had seen better days. His face, though handsome, bore an aspect of drawn exhaustion which the harsh station lights did nothing to soften. Holmes's glance, which could be like the touch of a lance, ran over him in an instant. "You have not eaten," he remarked. Penhaligon started. "No, Mr. Holmes. Since this morning I have felt little appetite." "And yet you refused the oysters brought round by the porter half an hour ago," Holmes continued, indicating with a languid hand the newspaper stand opposite. "Your umbrella bespeaks a man who was twice in rain today and only once in wind. Your Boots show Durham clay superimposed upon the darker grit of Marylebone Road. And there, he lifted with 2 fingers a thin creased telegram laying partly hidden beneath the valise strap. There is your true cause of pallor. The Langham delivered this to you after you called on us, and it has not left your person since. Our client's composure fled. Upon my word, sir, you see into a fellow as though he were made of glass. It is from Mrs. Fisk, the widow. Holmes regarded the blue slip, which bore signs of having been repeatedly unfolded. May I? Penhaligon handed it to him with an air of reluctance. Holmes read aloud. Return unnecessary. Interment complete. All secured. A.F. Holmes's nostrils dilated. Short, cool. The widow uses her husband's initials to countersign condolence. A curious coldness there. All secured. Secured, we may ask, from whom? From the living or from the dead? He returned the slip. Come, gentlemen, the north calls. Our journey was of that dim and tedious sort known to travellers on a November night. We were lulled to a soporific calm by the rocking of the carriage and the continuous drone of wheels. At such times Holmes would sometimes permit himself to drift into a brown study over the mists of his own choosing. But on this occasion he employed the hours with method. He drew from his pocket-book a dozen small clippings, the fruits of that indefatigable press, indexing which formed one of the lesser-known engines of his success. Observe, Watson, said he, tapping one item with his forefinger. The late Sir Algernon Fisk, Baronet, 56, industrial interests in tin and coal, a modest patron of antiquarian societies, aversion to public life, a wife much his junior, no issue. He purchased Ravenshade Hall 8 years past from a family in decline. See also the notice of a suit brought against him by certain miners for improvements withheld. Settled out of court. Hard dealings, then. Hard, though perhaps not harder than commerce allows. He held up another cutting. Here is the butler, Graves, one of those fixtures in human oak that houses like Ravenshade delight to keep. 30 years in service, first under the previous owners, then under Sir Algernon. No blemish recorded. Yet our friend tells us the man fell to whispering with no companion, and vanished the day after the funeral was fixed. I confess, that piques me. Penhaligon spoke, low and hurried. Whispering, yes, Mr. Holmes. I told you truly. Once, passing the corridor, I heard the murmur of his voice when I could swear he was alone. When I entered the pantry, there was no one there but Graves, standing very stiff with a decanter in his hand. He replied, when I questioned him, that he had been rehearsing the wine list. It was a clumsy answer, sir, and not in his usual vein. Holmes's lids drooped. A man rehearses when he anticipates a part, or when he fears to betray what he truly knows. Tell me again of the bell. Penhaligon clasped his hands tighter. It was near 11 o'clock. Sir Algernon had retired to his study after dinner. I remained in the small library preparing some letters for dictation the following morning. There came a single peal from the servant's bell, the one from the study. I waited for Graves or one of the footmen to answer it, but no one came. The house was unusually quiet. After some minutes, I went myself. The bell rope in the study was swaying slightly, Mr. Holmes, like a pendulum that would not die. Sir Algernon sat at his desk, head bowed, a pen fallen from his fingers. He might have been dozing. But when I touched his shoulder, I found him cold. The physician called it disease of the heart. Holmes had listened with half-closed eyes. A single peal, he repeated. A swaying rope, a closed room, and a servant who next morning is gone. It is an old house, you say? Parts of it are Tudor, Penhaligon answered. There are passages under the east wing that Mrs. Fisk keeps locked. Ah, locked passages have in them a poetry that a modern corridor cannot boast, Holmes murmured. There is in old architecture a conspiracy with crime. We shall see what verses Ravenshade composes. Towards dawn I dozed. When the porter's cry of Durham roused me, my friend was already at the window, the pale light drawing hard lines upon his ascetic features. The country lay under a veil of silver-rimed fields and low black hedgerows. A raw wind met us as we descended at the platform, and our breaths went forth like little ghosts before our faces. Penhaligon procured a dog-cart from a local livery, and we set off along a winding lane that climbed steadily among ridges and hollows. In time, the path broadened, and there, upon a gentle rise, we perceived the mass of Ravenshade Hall, a long, low house of dark stone with mullioned windows like heavy-lidded eyes, and a roof-line broken by tall chimneys from which a sluggish smoke drifted. Holmes surveyed it with evident satisfaction. "A melancholic aspect," he said. "Excellent." A footman in black livery admitted us to a square hall floored in black and white marble, where the air had a chill even the grand fire could not wholly dispel. There were portraits, lean gentlemen and powdered ladies, and above the stair, a severe ancestor with a hunting crop. Our coats being taken, we were ushered into a morning room whose windows looked upon what must once have been Italian gardens, but were now stern beds of laurel and box, frost-rimmed and silent. Mrs. Fiske entered. She was a woman of perhaps 30, with that pallor which belongs not only to grief but to nature, cool, composed, and very handsome, in a manner that forbade easy approach. The deep mourning did not conceal the fineness of her figure, and the steady regard she turned upon Holmes made me think she measured men habitually, and was rarely satisfied with them. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending a hand whose rings were few and well chosen, "you are welcome to Ravenshade. I trust this will be a short visit. I have a horror of lingering inquisitions." "Madam," said Holmes, bowing, "my business thrives upon brevity when truth is ready to show her face. She is a coy lady, but not invincible." He indicated me. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who assists me more than he allows in print." She inclined her head to me. "The world credits you with miracles, Mr. Holmes. I hope you will work one that ends with tranquility." "Tranquility comes oftenest," Holmes returned, "after disturbance has been thoroughly understood." At a sign from his mistress, the footman brought coffee and bread still steaming from the ovens. Penhaligon, poor fellow, ate as though he had not seen food in days. Holmes took only coffee, though he examined with lively interest the crumbs the footman brushed from the cloth. I saw his nostrils quiver almost imperceptibly. "You shall see my husband's study," said Mrs. Fiske. "I have not permitted the servants to alter anything." "It will be of the greatest service," Holmes replied. "One question first. On the day after Sir Algernon's death, your butler, Graves, disappeared." "Regrettably," she said, with a shadow of annoyance passing over her features. "He left no letter. I have procured the services of a temporary man from Bishop Auckland. It is an inconvenience, but no more." "Graves was long with the house." "Too long," she said in a tone evenly pitched. "Old servants are sometimes like old ivy, Mr. Holmes, clinging, secretive, and exerting a pressure that cracks the stone." Holmes's eyes glinted. "A botanical observation of merit. The study, if you please." We traversed a corridor lined with glass-fronted bookcases and came to a door of dark oak polished by many hands. Mrs. Fiske unlocked it with a key she wore at her belt. The study was of generous proportion, panelled in oak, with a high mantel and a pair of leaded windows looking upon the eastern lawn. A large escritoire stood by the window. Upon it lay papers arranged with that deceptive neatness which conceals a recent disorder. In the corner was a speaking tube terminating in a brass whistle, and beside the fireplace a bell pull with a thick braided cord of crimson and gold, the tassel of which hung at a height convenient to a seated man. Holmes, once admitted, became a creature of another order, quick, noiseless, and all attention. He stood in the center with his eyes half closed, as if listening to a voice that spoke only to him. Then, dropping upon one knee, he ran a finger along the skirting, peered behind the coal scuttle, and examined with his magnifying lens certain marks upon the wooden fender. He smelt the air as a hound might, and twice opened and shut the casement with a delicate touch. "Watson," he said, after a moment, "what do you make of the hearth?" I approached. The fire was newly laid, yet beneath the visible coal there lingered a fine grey ash. With a poker I disturbed it and drew forth what I took to be the charred remnant of a letter. Holmes nodded. "Paper burnt with deliberation 3 days ago," he murmured, "and not wholly consumed. The grate was closed too soon. Observe the irregularity in the ash, as if a wire or small rod had been thrust among the embers." Penhaligon, who had followed us with anxious eyes, broke in. There was nothing of the sort when I found Sir Algernon." "Quite," Holmes returned indifferently. He next addressed himself to the bell-pull. Taking the tassel lightly, he set it in motion. The rope responded with a curious elasticity, as if impeded along part of its course. He checked its vibration with thumb and forefinger, then stepped to the door and, opening it, called down the corridor. "Be so good as to pull the bell in the pantry, Mr. Penhaligon." A moment later a faint jingle answered. Holmes listened intently, then smiled his thin smile. "Thank you. That will do." "The bell called no one that night," said Penhaligon uneasily. "No one came." Holmes returned. "What you heard then was a bell that rang. But to whom?" He moved to the writing table, where he bent over the blotting pad. "Watson, the mirror." There was a small mirror upon a stand near the inkstand. Holmes held it against the blotter at an angle and read by the reversed impression a few scrawled words, not Sir Algernon's hand, but a sharper, more angular script, "Not safe to speak. S." He tore off the corner and placed it in his pocketbook. "Curious," he remarked. "Initials sometimes lie, but they sometimes speak in voices louder than their owners." Mrs. Fiske had watched us with a composure that never once descended to fidgeting. "If you have finished with the room, Mr. Holmes, I would have it restored to order." "In a moment, madam. One last inquiry. This cord, when was it installed?" "It has always been there," she replied. Holmes's tone sharpened. "Always? Pray indulge me. Is there anyone in the house who can attest the condition of this bell-pull a month ago?" She lifted her chin slightly. "Graves might have known. But Graves, as you observe, has absented himself." Holmes bowed as if at a conclusion. "Then we must look elsewhere for testimony." I next requested, so unceremoniously that even I was taken aback, to be led where the servants have the kindness not to lead their betters, by which he meant the passages behind the walls. Mrs. Fiske's nostril appeared to tremble, though whether in amusement or annoyance I could not say. She rang, and the interim butler, a heavy-jowled man named Pratt, took us through a door under the stair and into a narrow corridor which ran parallel with the principal hall. The walls were whitewashed. The air smelt of coal, soap, and iron polish. A map of the bell wires, ingeniously arranged, hung near the pantry, each room corresponding to a little clapper in a wooden case. Holmes's interest, I need hardly say, was intense. He traced with a fingertip the wire-marked study, which ran upward along the wall, then vanished into a hole bored through lath and timber. "Remove the cover," he said to Pratt. The man hesitated. "Beg pardon, sir. My lady." "Your mistress," said Holmes, with a flash of steel in his voice, "has given me leave to examine what concerns her husband's death. The cover, if you please." The screws yielded. Within we saw the spring and clapper of the study bell. The wire, however, did not present the clean line of its neighbors. It had been looped, ever so slightly, around the wooden peg of an adjacent bell, as if in some former arrangement they had lain together and been hurriedly set back. Holmes's eye gleamed. He lifted the wire with the blade of his penknife and let it fall again. It caught for a fraction of a second, then sprang free. "Watson," he murmured, "what do you infer?" "That the wire was tampered with," I returned. "But to what end?" "To the end," Holmes interrupted, "that a pull given in one room might simulate a pull in another, or that a pull given by something other than a human hand might be communicated where no servant expects it. It is but a conjecture, yet conjectures are the tinder of inference." He set the cover back with his own slender hands and turned to Pratt. "In the last fortnight, were any repairs made to this apparatus?" "None that I know of, sir," the man replied doggedly. Holmes looked at him with a kind of bleak amusement. You possess the air of a man who finds loyalty has become a heavier coat than he thought to carry. Take care it does not drown you when the waters rise." The fellow colored and moved aside. We proceeded along the back passage to a narrow door reinforced by a bar. Pratt produced a key and unlocked it. A chill beyond ordinary draughts flowed over us. Holmes stepped through, and we followed him into a stone corridor that descended gently. The roof was low. Our breath made low clouds. "The Tudor undercroft," Penhaligon whispered. "Mrs. Fiske keeps it shut except when wine is needed." Holmes's lantern, for he had requisitioned one from the pantry, sent a feeble halo before us. Dust lay evenly upon the stones, but not so evenly that an eye trained to such things, and Holmes's was trained to them like a falcon, could not detect a disturbance. He stooped, then knelt, and at last stretched himself prone with that glorious disregard for appearances which is the essence of genius. When he rose, his fingers bore a smear the color of soot, and there were tiny grains adhering to his cuff that glittered faintly. "Coal dust and tin sand," he said softly to me. "An odd marriage. File that with our other nuptials, Watson. A repentant bellwire wedded to an absent servant. A paper burned with haste. A widow who loves tranquillity better than questions." We came at length to a stout door whose iron latch had a bloom of rust upon it. Holmes tried it. It was locked. "Whose key?" he asked. "Mrs. Fiske's," said Pratt. "Always." "Always," Holmes repeated in the same tone Mrs. Fiske had used. A word that comforts the innocent and distresses the guilty. Back in the daylight of the hall, Mrs. Fiske received our report with a serenity that did her credit. "You will have your luncheon, Mr. Holmes, and then tell me your conclusions." "My conclusions, madam," he returned, "are like the British Constitution, existent but not written down. I must beg the favor of remaining under your roof tonight. There are phenomena that reveal themselves only in their native hours. You shall have what rooms you wish," she said coolly. "Mr. Penhaligon knows the house well enough to see you accommodated." Before we parted, Holmes paused with a hand upon the newel. "One triviality, Mrs. Fiske, who in this house smokes a Balkan blend adulterated with a trace of Latakia, and, if my nose be not in error, the faintest essence of orange peel?" She regarded him unblinking. "No one in my household smokes indoors, Mr. Holmes, not since the year I came here." "Then your rule was briefly forgotten," said he, "upon the morning-room hearth not 2 hours before we were admitted." He bowed. "It is of no moment. The laws of hospitality are sacred, and so, it seems, are some others." In our chamber, a spare, clean room whose windows looked upon the east lawn and the bare-limbed elms, Holmes flung himself into the chair and steepled his fingers. "Watson," he said, "you will do me a service." "Anything, Holmes." "At 11 o'clock tonight you will station yourself in the small library where Penhaligon prepared his letters. You will sit with the door ajar toward the corridor and your eyes upon the study. If you hear a bell, do not move. If you see a light, do not speak. I shall be elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" He smiled with that singular air of mischief which, on his ascetic features, had the quality of moonlight upon water. "Where a silent servant may be tempted to whisper, a patient intruder may learn a good deal. Until then, my dear fellow, we shall cultivate that greatest of all detective virtues, idleness, and leave the house to imagine us harmless." "Holmes," I cried, for his vagueness stung me, "you have some idea." "I have, Watson, the merest sprig of an idea," he answered. "It will either blossom by nightfall or wither to nothing by morning. For the present, let it remain pressed between the pages of my mind like a fern one keeps in a book. Pretty to look upon, but not yet part of the landscape." And so it was, that as the pale northern day declined and the long corridors of Ravenshade darkened, we took our stations. Holmes in his unannounced quarter, I in the little library with pen and paper before me, affecting to be absorbed in notes I could not, for the life of me, compose. The house had that curious silence which belongs to graveyards and to dwellings that keep a secret. Somewhere, Far off, a clock beat the hour. A draught crept along the skirting. The flame of the lamp made a small, valiant sound. If I confess that my pulse quickened and my imagination, soldier though it had been, played me tricks with shadows and the shapes of furniture, I do so knowing that there are braver men than I who would have felt the same. For there is courage of the field, and there is the courage which sits in a chair and listens, an art in which my friend, I suspect, intended that I should be tutored. 11 o'clock approached. I had my eyes upon the half-open door, the corridor beyond filmed with darkness, and the carved panels of Sir Algernon's study looming like a presence at the end. The stillness was such that the faintest creak would have rung out like a pistol shot. Then, with a suddenness that seemed to rip the air, there came the clear, unmistakable peal of a bell. Not the servants' chatter in their wooden hive, not the distant dinner call, but the study bell, single and sharp as Penhaligon had heard it that fatal night. I did not move. I did not breathe. The rope, I knew, would be swaying, and the room beyond sat, occupied or empty, God knew which. Somewhere in the underparts of the house a whisper shivered along the wires, and in that instant, though I could not see him, I knew that Sherlock Holmes, who loves the midnight truth as some men love wine, had turned his face toward it. Chapter 3. The Shadow Behind the Study Door. I have been present in the course of my friendship with Sherlock Holmes at moments of peril more tangible than that which overtook us at Ravenshade Hall. Yet never, I confess, have I felt a more intolerable tension than during that midnight vigil. The sound of that bell seemed to echo long after it had ceased, reverberating through my very nerves. For several minutes I sat rigid, scarcely daring to breathe. The door of the study stood half open at the corridor's end, the faintest glimmer of firelight visible from within. Beyond it, silence. No footstep followed, no voice replied. The house itself appeared to hold its breath. I might have imagined the whole thing, save that my hand upon the desk trembled as though the vibration of the sound still ran through it. It was then that I caught, or believed I caught, the faintest suggestion of motion, a shadow that passed across the narrow band of firelight in the study doorway. The movement was slow, deliberate, and noiseless, as of one accustomed to moving unseen. My instinct was to spring forward, but Holmes's injunction rang in my memory. If you hear a bell, do not move. If you see a light, do not speak. So I sat, chained by obedience and fear alike, listening. There came next a dull scraping, as of something being drawn along the floor. Then again stillness. I could endure it no longer. With infinite caution I rose and stepped into the corridor. The air was chill and heavy with the scent of burning coal. A faint radiance issued from the study, wavering and uncertain, as if a candle had been moved within. I approached slowly, each board beneath my boots creaking like a gunshot. When I reached the threshold, I hesitated, for the sight that met my eyes was one to give any man pause. The great desk stood as before, the papers upon it undisturbed, and the bell rope hung swaying gently. But before the hearth crouched a figure, a man by the outline, clad in dark livery, his back turned to me. The candle in his hand threw an unsteady glow upon the oaken panels. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could utter a word he turned. It was the face of an old man, thin, deeply lined, and ghastly pale. The eyes, dark and sunken, met mine for one fleeting second, before a look of unspeakable terror crossed his features. He dropped the candle, which went out at once, and in that same instant a gust of icy air swept through the room, snuffing the fire and plunging everything into darkness. "Holmes!" I cried involuntarily. From the shadows behind me came the calm, low voice of my friend. "Very good, Watson. You have seen him too." A match flared, casting that brief ghostly light upon Holmes's austere face. He crossed to the desk, lit the candle afresh, and turned to me with a look of the keenest interest. "You saw the man distinctly?" "I did. An elderly servant in livery. He vanished as the candle fell." Vanished indeed, said Holmes dryly, bending to the floor. You perceive no footprints? I looked. The carpet before the hearth was thick and undisturbed. Not so much as a crease or mark betrayed the passage of any living thing. Holmes's eyes glittered. Excellent. Our ghost, it seems, possesses a physicist's understanding of pressure distribution, or more likely an accomplice with a broom. He straightened abruptly. Watson, you will oblige me by waking Mr. Penhaligon. Tell him I require his assistance immediately. I did as I was told, though not without a sense of foreboding. When Penhaligon appeared moments later, his face pale and drawn beneath the lamplight, Holmes was already kneeling at the skirting near the fireplace, examining with his lens what appeared to be a faint crack in the paneling. You are certain, Mr. Penhaligon, said Holmes without looking up, that this wall backs directly onto the east corridor? Yes, sir. There is no door there, only solid timber. Solid timber, yes, Holmes repeated softly. So solid that it conceals a hinge. He pressed his hand along the wainscot, and to my astonishment a section of panel slid inward with scarcely a sound, revealing a narrow recess beyond, black as pitch. Watson, the lantern, if you please. He thrust it into the aperture. A short flight of steps descended into darkness, terminating in what appeared to be a stone passage. The air that came up was cold and earthy, with that peculiar chill that speaks of long disuse. An admirable contrivance, Holmes murmured. Ravenshade keeps its secrets well. Mr. Penhaligon, I trust you have courage enough to accompany me. Whatever is required, sir, the young man replied, though I saw the tremor in his hand as he took the lantern. We descended single file, Holmes first, then Penhaligon, and I bringing up the rear. The steps gave way to a low vaulted passage, the walls sweating with moisture. Our light glinted upon something metallic along the right-hand wall, bell wires, dusty but still intact. Observe, Watson, said Holmes, pausing. The same brass sheathing as upstairs. This passage runs directly beneath the study and the servants' wing. It would be the simplest matter in the world for a man stationed here to tug at a connected wire and so ring the study bell above, while remaining unseen. But to what purpose? I demanded. That, said Holmes, is what we are here to discover. We advanced a few paces more until the corridor widened into a small stone chamber. There, upon an overturned crate, lay a coil of wire, a hammer, and several small tools, and beside them a lantern still faintly warm to the touch. Holmes held his own light close and uttered a short exclamation. The wick has been trimmed within the last hour. Our visitor, Watson, is not a phantom, but a man of flesh and bone. Penhaligon stared around in bewilderment. But who? Graves? Could he still be alive? Holmes did not answer. He was crouched beside a narrow door at the far end of the chamber, his long fingers tracing the edges. Locked on this side, he said. And yet there are footprints, small ones leading outward. A woman's, if I am not mistaken. He rose swiftly. Come, Watson. We must return before our absence is remarked. By the time we regained the study, the first faint light of dawn was creeping through the eastern windows. Holmes replaced the panel and stood for a long moment in silence, his brow furrowed in deep thought. At present, he said finally, we are dealing with at least two actors upon our little stage, one who manipulates wires in darkness, and another who walks where no woman should. It is a curious duet, and I fancy the refrain shall grow louder before long. He turned to Penhaligon. Say nothing of this discovery, not even to Mrs. Fiske. I shall make certain arrangements before nightfall. For now we breakfast. When we joined the household later that morning, Mrs. Fiske greeted us with her usual cold civility. Her eyes, however, lingered for a moment upon Holmes's face, as though she sought to read some hidden knowledge there. You slept well, I hope, gentlemen? She asked. Excellently, Holmes replied with a composure that might have deceived a saint. The air of Ravenshade is most invigorating. Indeed, she said. It agrees with few. The exchange, brief though it was, left an odd flavor behind it. There was a subtle hostility in her tone, an unspoken challenge. I could see that Holmes had marked it too, for as soon as she had turned away, he muttered under his breath, "There, Watson, speaks a woman who knows she is watched." He rose from the table. "Our work begins in earnest today. I would have a word with the groom, the new butler, and, if she will permit it, the widow herself. There is something I must confirm regarding her late husband's will." The remainder of that day passed in quiet observation. Holmes spent much of it in the servants' quarters, questioning the staff with that unassuming air which made his inquiries seem no more than idle curiosity. I accompanied him as far as the stables, where the groom, a nervous fellow named Tregellis, confessed that he had heard scratching sounds in the east wing 2 nights prior, but had thought them rats. When we returned to the main hall, Holmes paused before the portrait of Sir Algernon Fiske that hung above the stair. A stern visage, rendered in oils, the eyes painted with such intensity that one might swear they followed the observer. "Watson," said Holmes quietly, "study that face. There is pride, obstinacy, perhaps cruelty, yet also fear. A man at war with his own conscience. You think, then, that Sir Algernon's death was no accident?" "My dear fellow," Holmes replied, "when a man builds secret passages, tampers with bell wires, and keeps his servants in fear, he writes his own epitaph long before he dies. But who held the pen that wrote it? That we must still uncover." That night, as we retired once more to our chamber, Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the pale moonlight that silvered the frost-bound lawns. "Watson," he said without turning, "have you ever observed how silence itself may become an accomplice to crime? The very walls here seem to listen. I begin to suspect that Ravenshade's most faithful servant was never the butler at all. But the silence that guards what men dare not speak." He drew the curtains and faced me with a grave expression. "Tomorrow we shall open the door beneath the house, and, my dear fellow, I should advise you to bring your revolver." Chapter 4. The Door Beneath the House. The following day broke cold and colourless, the morning light filtering through a veil of mist that lay upon the lawns like a burial shroud. Even the air within the hall seemed heavy with expectation. Holmes, who had slept little, was already up when I rose. He stood before the window, pipe in hand, watching the fog drift among the trees. "You slept soundly, I trust, Watson?" he asked without turning. "Hardly," I confessed. "After last night's encounter, I could scarce close my eyes. What do you make of it? Was it Graves we saw?" Holmes smiled faintly, though his gaze remained fixed outside. "If it was, then we are dealing with a man capable of defying not only the laws of Scotland Yard, but those of nature itself. No, my dear fellow, our visitor was of flesh and blood, though whose flesh and whose blood remain to be established." He turned from the window. "Come, Watson, there is work before us. I propose we visit that subterranean door beneath the hall, by daylight this time, and with the proper tools." The descent. We found Mr. Penhaligon already waiting in the corridor. Looking pale but resolute, he carried a lantern and a small iron crowbar procured from the stables. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Courage and prudence together are rare virtues, Mr. Penhaligon. Lead on, and let us see whether Ravenshade conceals a chamber more silent even than its servants." The panel in Sir Algernon's study yielded to Holmes's touch as before, and soon the three of us stood once more within the narrow, damp corridor beneath the house. The chill of the air struck through our clothing, and droplets of moisture clung to the stone like dew upon a tomb. Holmes examined the walls attentively, noting with satisfaction that the marks of recent passage remained visible in the dust. "Our friend of last night was here, and not long before us. Let us hope he has left us something in exchange for his secrecy." At the far end the small iron door awaited us. Holmes knelt and inspected the lock. "A crude mechanism," he muttered. "Victorian work grafted upon Tudor masonry. Always a marriage of discord." He inserted a thin blade into the keyhole and listened intently as he worked. After a moment came the soft click of success. "Now, gentlemen," he said, Prepare your nerves. Whatever lies beyond has been kept from sight for many years. The door swung inward with a moan of rusted hinges, and a gust of stale air rushed out, thick with the odor of earth and decay. Holmes raised his lantern. Before us stretched a vaulted cellar lined with ancient barrels and crates, their surfaces furred with dust. A narrow flight of steps led downward still farther into darkness. The hidden vault. We descended cautiously. The floor was uneven, strewn with fragments of stone. At the bottom, the passage widened into what had once been a wine vault but now served a different purpose. The barrels had been pushed aside to form a crude work area, and upon a rough wooden table lay a collection of instruments, spools of wire, sheets of parchment, several candles burned to stubs, and an open journal. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he examined the latter. A diary, Watson, and by the hand I should judge it to be our missing servant's." He turned the pages rapidly, scanning the crabbed handwriting. "Listen to this entry, dated 3 days before Sir Algernon's death. The master grows fearful. He has forbidden the use of the east wing and the lower vault. Yet each night he comes here himself, lantern in hand. He speaks aloud to the empty air, as though to one unseen. He swears that if she is silent, he will make her speak again." Holmes looked up sharply. "You see, Watson, the case assumes a new complexion. We have here not only secrecy, but obsession." "Who is the she?" I asked. "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the question. Continue." I took the lantern and examined the rest of the vault. Near the far wall, something caught the light, a glimmer of brass half buried in the dust. I stooped and drew forth a peculiar object, a mask of some kind, fashioned of thin metal, the interior lined with cloth. 2 small tubes extended from it, ending in valves. Holmes took it from my hands and turned it over. "Remarkable. An experimental respirator, perhaps, or a device intended to muffle speech. Note the inside. The cloth is damp with traces of a chemical, chloroform by the odor. Yet see the size of it. Not for a man's face. This was made for a woman." Penhaligon recoiled slightly. "Good Lord, you don't suggest—" "I suggest nothing," said Holmes, "until we know more. But consider. A mask that prevents one from speaking, a diary that mentions a woman compelled to silence, a bell that rings of its own accord. These, my friends, are not fragments. They are the spokes of a single wheel." He paced the vault, lantern raised. Suddenly he stopped before a section of wall, where the masonry appeared newer than the rest. "Observe, Watson, the mortar here is lighter, a recent repair." He rapped upon it with his knuckles, and a hollow sound answered. "Bring the crowbar." Penhaligon handed it to him, and Holmes, with a strength I had not thought in his spare frame, levered out one of the stones. Behind it yawned a cavity scarcely 2 feet deep. Within lay a small box of polished wood bound with brass. Holmes withdrew it carefully and set it upon the table. "Now, Watson, if you would be so good as to open it." I hesitated. "It may contain—" "Precisely," Holmes interrupted. "Whatever it contains, it will not thank us for hesitation." The latch gave easily. Inside were several folded papers, a length of dark hair tied with ribbon, and a miniature portrait, the likeness of a young woman, strikingly beautiful, her expression both proud and sorrowful. Beneath it was a label, "Margaret Fiske, 1872. Holmes regarded it for a long moment. "Sir Algernon's first wife," he said softly. "She died 13 years ago." Penhaligon started. "But Mrs. Fiske? She told me Sir Algernon had never been married before." Holmes nodded grimly. "Precisely, a lie so deliberate that it invites curiosity. And see, these papers are marriage and burial certificates, each signed and witnessed. Yet here is the peculiarity. The burial entry bears the date of her supposed death, but the certificate of interment is unsigned. This woman, I fancy, was buried only in name. The discovery—" At that moment a faint sound reached us from above. A footstep, cautious and deliberate. Holmes raised his finger for silence. The noise receded, then stopped altogether. "We are being watched," he whispered. "Quickly, replace everything as we found it." We restored the box to its niche and the stone to its place, leaving no trace of disturbance. Then, extinguishing the lantern, we withdrew through the narrow passage and re-entered the study. The panel slid shut just as a knock sounded at the outer door. It was Mrs. Fiske. Her dark eyes moved from Holmes to Penhaligon, and then to me. "I beg your pardon," she said smoothly, "but I was told you were abroad upon the grounds. May I ask why you are here, gentlemen, and why the air smells of lamp oil?" Holmes's composure was magnificent. "A small experiment, madam. Dr. Watson was assisting me in an inquiry regarding the effect of atmospheric pressure upon bell mechanisms." "Indeed," she said, her tone polite but cold. "And did you find the answer?" "Only in part," Holmes replied, smiling. "But I expect the conclusion will reveal itself, perhaps before the week is out." She lingered a moment longer, her gaze lingering upon Holmes as if she suspected more than she said. Then, with a faint inclination of the head, she withdrew. When the door closed behind her, Holmes turned to us, his voice low but tense with suppressed excitement. "Gentlemen, the lady knows more than she dares to admit. Her calm is the calm of one walking over thin ice." Penhaligon looked stricken. "Then you believe she had some hand in her husband's silence?" Holmes interjected. "That, my dear sir, remains to be seen. But I will tell you this. Ravenshade Hall holds not one grave, but two, and of these only one has yet been opened." He stood for a moment by the fireplace, his tall figure outlined against the dim light. "Tonight, Watson, we shall test whether the dead truly rest beneath this roof, or whether they walk, silent and unseen, through the halls of Ravenshade." Chapter 5. The Widow's Secret. The events of that morning had stirred the atmosphere of Ravenshade Hall into something at once brittle and expectant. One could almost feel the place listening. Each corridor, each panelled wall, every silent clock counting down to revelation. Even the servants went about their duties with that half-fearful quiet which is peculiar to houses haunted not by ghosts, but by secrets. Holmes, after our encounter with Mrs. Fiske, appeared more restless than I had ever seen him. He passed from the hearth to the window, then to the escritoire, pausing only to examine his watch or adjust some unseen trifle upon the mantelpiece. I knew that this feverish energy betokened a mind in high tension, and I wisely refrained from interrupting him. At length he spoke. "Watson, we have arrived at a crucial juncture. The time for passive observation is past. The time for confrontation begins." "With Mrs. Fiske?" I asked. "Indeed. I have observed that the lady is mistress not only of this house, but of her own emotions. Such self-command is a fortress, and one must choose carefully where to place the first charge. This afternoon, my dear fellow, we shall pay her a visit in her private drawing-room. She expects it not, and that is the very reason she will betray herself." The widow's drawing-room. At the appointed hour, we presented ourselves before Mrs. Fiske. The room into which we were shown was of delicate taste, walls of pale green silk, fine china upon the mantel, and a single portrait above the pianoforte, a woman seated beside a child. The face was younger, softer, yet unmistakable. "Mrs. Fiske," said Holmes, bowing slightly, "you are a woman of refinement and discernment, and I hope you will forgive a question that may appear indelicate. Who is the lady represented in that portrait?" She regarded him steadily. "It is myself, Mr. Holmes, many years ago, before my marriage. The child was my niece." "Ah," said Holmes softly, "and yet the painter has written upon the canvas, Margaret Fiske, 1872. A curious coincidence of names, is it not?" The faintest shadow crossed her features, but her voice remained calm. "An artist's fancy, no doubt. The date must be mistaken." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps. And yet it is remarkable that the same name should occur in certain papers belonging to your late husband, papers we had occasion to examine this morning." At this she rose abruptly. "You had occasion. Mr. Holmes, I was not aware that you were empowered to search my house at will. My dear madam, said Holmes gently, when a man dies under circumstances that his servant calls unnatural, the boundaries of courtesy must sometimes yield to the imperatives of truth. I assure you that what we found was examined only in the service of justice, and of your own safety. Her hands, which had been clasped before her, tightened upon one another. My safety. Explain yourself. Holmes stepped nearer. His tone remained mild, but his eyes had the glitter of steel. I believe, Mrs. Fisk, that your husband lived under a delusion which has now cost him his life. He was convinced that the woman he had once loved, his first wife Margaret, was dead. I think, on the contrary, that she lived here, within these walls, and that you knew it. For the first time I saw her composure waver. She sank into a chair, her breath coming short and fast. This is monstrous, she whispered. You cannot know. I know, Holmes interrupted quietly, that Sir Algernon maintained a chamber beneath this house where a woman was kept, in secret. I know that he feared her silence and that he devised a means to make her speak again. I know, too, that when he died, his butler vanished, perhaps because he could no longer bear the part he had been made to play. She covered her face with her hands. For a moment there was no sound but the crackle of the fire. Then she looked up suddenly, her eyes burning with something between defiance and despair. You are wrong, Mr. Holmes, she said. Wrong in part, though not in spirit. The woman you speak of was not his wife. She was his sister. Holmes's brows lifted a fraction. Indeed? Yes, Margaret Fisk, his sister by birth, though she bore the same name as his first wife, who died years before he married me. She was afflicted, Mr. Holmes. Her mind had been unbalanced since youth. When her illness worsened, Sir Algernon placed her in the care of a private asylum. But some years ago, when the institution was closed, he brought her here, to Ravenshade, insisting that he alone could tend her. He told no one for fear of scandal. Even I was forbidden to see her. Holmes listened with folded arms. And yet you learned the truth. I did. It was not difficult to guess when the servants began to whisper of strange noises, of footsteps in the east wing. I confronted him, but he swore that she was harmless, that her condition demanded silence and solitude. I believed him. Her voice faltered. But lately she grew worse. She would scream when the bells rang, and once she struck Graves when he tried to bring her food. After that he refused to go near her. Sir Algernon dismissed all the other servants from that part of the house. Then came that terrible night. Tell us, said Holmes. I had retired early, she continued, when I heard the bell from the study. I thought nothing of it at first, but a few minutes later there was another sound. A shriek, faint but dreadful. When I reached the corridor, my husband was already dead. Greaves was the first to find him, or so I believed. But when I turned, he was gone. The next morning his room was empty. Holmes's expression did not change, but I, who knew him, could see that his mind was racing. You are certain, he said, that the woman was confined in the east wing? Yes, there is a stair behind the chapel that leads to her chamber. But, Mr. Holmes, if she escaped, if she was the one you saw last night, then heaven help us all, for she has lost what reason she ever possessed. The ascent to the east wing. Holmes rose swiftly. Then it is there we must go. Watson, fetch your revolver. Mr. Penhaligon, you will remain with Mrs. Fisk. Lock the doors and admit no one unless I give the word. Mrs. Fisk would have spoken, but Holmes silenced her with a gesture. Courage, madam. If your husband's sister still lives, we may yet save her from worse than death. We made our way through the dim corridors to the chapel. I see a small disused room heavy with the smell of mildew and candle wax. Behind the altar, concealed by a curtain, we found a narrow stair spiraling upward. The steps were worn and damp, and more than once I stumbled in the gloom. At last we reached a landing where a single door stood closed. Holmes tried the handle. It was locked. He placed his ear to the wood and listened. For a long moment there was nothing. Then faintly we heard it, the slow rhythmic sound of breathing. Holmes motioned for silence, then drew a thin strip of metal from his coat. The lock yielded after a few seconds, and he pushed the door open. The room within was small, its single window barred. The air was stale, the walls bare save for a narrow bed and a table. Upon the bed sat a woman, her figure frail, her hair white as snow, though her face was not that of the aged. She looked up as we entered, and I shall never forget that face, the eyes bright with madness, the mouth curved into a silent smile. Holmes advanced slowly. "Miss Fisk," he said gently, "you need not fear. We are friends." She tilted her head as though listening to distant music, but made no reply. Around her neck hung a small metal object, an amulet or locket suspended by a chain. Holmes's gaze fixed upon it. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the locket. It bears the same initials, AF, as upon the telegram we saw at Euston." He extended his hand. "May I see that, madam?" In a flash her expression changed. With a shriek that tore through the stillness, she sprang to her feet and darted past us with astonishing speed. Holmes was after her in an instant, but she moved like a wraith, her white gown flickering through the shadows. Down the stair she fled, the sound of her feet echoing along the corridor. We gave chase, but by the time we reached the main hall, she was gone. Only the cold draught through the open chapel door told us the direction she had taken. Holmes stopped, his breath steady despite the exertion. "She will head for the vaults," he said. "It is the only place where she believes herself unseen." The silent revelation. We followed as swiftly as the darkness would allow. The panel in the study stood ajar, and the faint glimmer of light showed that our quarry had passed that way. Down the hidden stair we went once more, the chill of the cellar striking us like a blow. There, by the wall of newer masonry, the woman knelt, her fingers tearing frantically at the stones. She turned as we entered, her eyes wild. "He said I must be silent," she cried, "but the bell rings, and I cannot sleep. Tell him to stop ringing the bell." Holmes raised a hand. "Peace, Miss Fisk. Your brother cannot harm you now." She stared at him, trembling. "He is here," she whispered. "He listens through the wall." Then, before either of us could move, she gave a strangled cry and collapsed. Holmes was beside her in an instant, but it was too late. Her heart had ceased. Holmes closed her eyes and rose slowly. "The final silence, Watson," he said softly. "Merciful, perhaps, at last." He turned to the wall she had clawed at. "And yet she was right about one thing. There is someone listening through this wall. Someone who has listened for too long." He took up the crowbar and drove it hard into the mortar. Stone by stone the wall gave way, until at last a cavity appeared, deep and narrow. The lantern's light fell within, and I recoiled. There, seated upright as though in eternal vigil, was the withered form of a man in decaying livery. His head was bowed, his hand still clutching the end of a bell wire. Holmes looked down gravely. "The silent servant, Watson. Graves kept his master's secret even beyond death." He stepped back, his face pale but composed. "The rest will keep until morning. Come, my friend. We have seen enough of silence for one night." Chapter 6. The Bell and the Grave. The dawn that followed was one of those grey, reluctant mornings when light itself seems ashamed to intrude. A pale mist lay upon the moor beyond Ravenshade Hall, and from the chimneys rose thin, reluctant spirals of smoke that the air scarcely stirred. The household, awakened by the commotion of the night, had fallen into that strained hush peculiar to places where death has lately passed. Holmes and I broke our fast in the small parlour adjoining the study. Neither of us spoke for some minutes. The events of the previous night still clung to the air like the lingering odour of extinguished candles. At last Holmes pushed aside his untasted cup and leaned back in his chair. "Watson," he said quietly, "the dead man we found below, the servant Graves, was in his way the hinge upon which the whole machinery of this tragedy turned. I nodded. He had been dead for days, perhaps weeks. Yet how came he there? And why in such a posture, clutching the bell wire as though still at his duty? Holmes's thin lips curved in a melancholy smile. Because, my dear fellow, he died at his post. Quite literally so. You recall the position of his body? Seated, his hand grasping the wire that communicated with the study. The explanation is simple enough once one sees the mechanism. He rose and went to the hearth where the bell rope still hung, motionless now and sinister in its stillness. Observe. The pull descends through the paneling, passes the servants' corridor, and terminates in the undercroft. The wire runs directly through the cavity where we found Graves. He must have been stationed there by his master's order to respond to the bell from below rather than above. When Sir Algernon desired privacy, he used this private signal rather than risk the attention of the household. Then Graves remained hidden there deliberately. Precisely. But that secrecy proved his undoing. You remember, too, the diary entries? Graves wrote of the master's fear, his obsession with the silent woman. I believe Sir Algernon commanded his butler to stand ready each night in the vault, to watch through the small aperture in the wall and ensure that the woman, his sister Margaret, remained confined. The bell served both as warning and command. But on that last evening something went awry. Holmes paced the floor, his voice low and measured. Picture it, Watson. The master in his study, overwrought and trembling, the bell rope beside him. Below, the faithful servant, worn with age and dread. Perhaps the wire had caught, perhaps the spring was over-tightened. A sudden strain, a shock transmitted down the line, and the mechanism recoiled. The pull that should have summoned service struck back upon the one who waited. Graves, sitting too near, was ensnared by the wire as it sprang loose. A turn around the wrist, pressure, suffocation. He died there, unseen, while his master above waited for an answer that never came. I shuddered. A cruel irony, that the instrument meant for command should become an instrument of death. Cruel but fitting, Holmes murmured. The servant's silence reflected the master's tyranny. In this house, Watson, silence was both weapon and punishment. The widow's confession. At that moment a soft knock came at the door, and Mrs. Fiske entered. She was dressed in mourning still, but the proud composure that had so marked her was gone. Her eyes were hollow, her voice subdued. "Mr. Holmes," she began, "they tell me you have discovered something beneath the house. I beg you, conceal nothing from me." Holmes bowed. "Madam, you have borne much. Yet the truth, however bitter, is sometimes the only medicine for guilt." She looked at him sharply. "Then it was Graves?" "It was. He died in the service of a man who demanded obedience beyond endurance. And your husband, Sir Algernon, died by the same folly that destroyed his servant. The wire he devised betrayed him. When he rang that final summons, the force of it, redirected through the tampered mechanism, acted upon the spring behind him. He was struck down in an instant. Death by his own contrivance, as poetic as it is dreadful." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She sank slowly into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "You cannot know," she whispered, "what it was to live in that house with his fears. He would sit in that study for hours, listening for the bell, convinced that she, Margaret, was calling to him. At times he said he heard her speak his name through the floor. I thought it delusion, but now I see it was madness. His own creation answered him." Holmes stood by the window, his hands clasped behind him. "It was not only madness, madam, but remorse. I believe Sir Algernon wronged his sister grievously, perhaps confining her unjustly to conceal some family shame. His conscience turned upon him, and in his zeal to control what he had silenced, he invented this infernal system of bells and wires. In the end it was the echo of his own guilt that struck him dead." She looked up, her voice trembling. "And Margaret? She is gone?" "Yes," Holmes said gently. "Her heart failed her last night. She will trouble you no more." There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Fisk rose with sudden firmness. "Mr. Holmes, will you do me one service more? Whatever you write of this, if indeed you write at all, let my husband's name rest. Let the world believe him a victim of natural causes. There is enough sorrow buried in these walls." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "I have no wish to wound the living for the sake of the dead. You have my word." Holmes's reconstruction. Later that day, we stood once more in the Undercroft, the servants having been dismissed. Holmes pointed with his cane to the crude apparatus that ran along the wall. "You see, Watson, how the bell wires converge here. The study's line is distinct from the others, but loops back through a secondary pulley, one added recently, no doubt by Sir Algernon himself. The friction of age, combined with a damaged spring, caused a recoil along the lower segment. Graves, sitting close, attempted to adjust it at the very instant his master pulled from above. The result: instantaneous constriction, a silent death, literally strangled by duty. And Sir Algernon? Overwrought and exhausted, he must have exerted excessive force. The jolt rebounded through the wire, and the sudden failure of the spring threw him backward. The shock to his heart, already weak, was fatal. Thus the bell, the servant, and the master all fell silent together. Holmes replaced his cane under his arm and gazed about the dim chamber. "There is justice in mechanism, Watson. It obeys no passions, only the laws men themselves create. In his effort to command silence, Sir Algernon built the perfect servant, one that answered him with death." The quiet burial. The bodies of Graves and Margaret Fisk were interred the next day in the small churchyard that lay beyond the east lawn. The vicar spoke the briefest of services. The household attended in sombre array. Mrs. Fisk stood apart, her veil drawn, Mr. Penhaligon beside her in silent support. Holmes watched the ceremony with folded arms, his face expressionless save for a certain weary compassion. When the last spadeful of earth was thrown, he turned to me. "There lies more than 2 bodies, Watson. A lifetime of secrets, buried at last. Ravenshade may yet breathe again." As we made our way back toward the house, Penhaligon joined us. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "what shall I do now?" "I cannot remain in that place." Holmes looked at him with a faint smile. "Then do as the living ought. Leave the dead to their peace. Mrs. Fisk will require loyal counsel, and London offers opportunities for a man of integrity. You have proved both courage and conscience. I dare say you will find no lack of employment should you choose your future wisely." The young man clasped his hand fervently. "You have given me back more than honor, sir. You have given me purpose." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment, and the matter was left at that. The final reflection. We departed Ravenshade Hall the following morning, the mist once more closing around its chimneys as if to seal what had passed within. Holmes was unusually silent during the long journey to London. Only as we neared the city did he speak. "There is something profoundly human in this case, Watson," he said at last. "Here was a man who could not bear to hear the truth, and so built a world to stifle it. A world of wires, locks, and enforced silence. In doing so, he chained not only his sister, but himself. There is no cruelty like that born of remorse." He leaned back, his eyes half closed. "And yet it is well that we arrived when we did. Another day, and the mystery of Ravenshade would have been sealed forever. Its bell still, its servants gone, and the tale untold. Such cases are reminders, my dear fellow, that beneath the grandeur of England's old houses lies the same frailty that attends the humblest cottage: fear, guilt, and the desperate wish to be unseen." I looked at him with admiration, as I had so many times before. "You speak almost like a philosopher, Holmes." He smiled faintly. "Only an observer, Watson. And observation, as you know, is the beginning of all wisdom." The train thundered into Euston, and the familiar soot and clamour of London enveloped us once more. Whatever darkness we had left behind in the north, I felt it linger still, like a bell that, once rung, continues to vibrate in the soul long after the sound has died. Chapter 7. The Shadow Returns to Baker Street. It was upon the third evening after our return from Durham that I found my friend seated once more in his old armchair at Baker Street, his long legs stretched before the fire, his eyes half closed in that peculiar trance which often preluded the birth of some new deduction. The atmosphere of London, with its comforting din of wheels and voices, felt strangely alive after the oppressive stillness of Ravenshade Hall. Yet in Holmes's bearing there lingered the scent of that melancholy northern house, like smoke that clings to a man's coat long after the fire has gone out. "You appear preoccupied, Holmes," I said, laying aside my medical journal. "Does the ghost of Ravenshade still walk your imagination?" He opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "Not my imagination, Watson, for there at least reason reigns supreme. But the case itself, though concluded in the eyes of the law, continues to murmur its coda in my thoughts. There are notes yet unresolved, a dissonance, if you will, that refuses to be silenced." He reached for the morning's post upon the mantel, selecting from the heap a single envelope of heavy cream paper, sealed with black wax. "Observe. This letter was delivered not an hour ago, without name or address save Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street. No postmark. It was hand-delivered." He broke the seal and drew forth a folded sheet. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and unfamiliar. He read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you believe you have brought peace to Ravenshade. You are mistaken. The servant was not silent of his own will. The bell still rings, though no human hand touches it. Should you care to hear it for yourself, return before the new moon. But come alone. A friend." I confess I started. Surely a hoax. The village must be full of gossip by now. Holmes did not answer at once. He turned the letter over, examining the edges with a lens. "No common hand," he murmured. "Paper from a northern stationer of a grade rarely purchased except by the gentry. The ink is recent, the handwriting a firm, deliberate, and not that of Mrs. Fiske. Moreover, Watson, the phrasing bears the stamp of one acquainted with the matter intimately. The servant was not silent of his own will. That is a phrase of knowledge, not hearsay." He laid the paper aside. "A friend indeed, though whether to truth or mischief remains to be seen. A curious visitor." That afternoon, while Holmes busied himself with chemical experiments, our landlady entered bearing a visiting card upon a tray. "A gentleman to see you, sir. Says it's urgent." The card read, "Mr. Jonas Pratt, formerly in the service of Sir Algernon Fiske." "Pratt!" Holmes exclaimed. "The interim butler. Show him in at once, Mrs. Hudson." The visitor proved to be a large, heavy-featured man in worn black clothes, his manner at once obsequious and uneasy. He bowed low. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen. I heard tell you was back in London, Mr. Holmes, and I thought, well, there's something I couldn't keep to myself no longer." Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Speak freely, Mr. Pratt. It's about the bell, sir. The one in the study at Ravenshade. After you left, Mrs. Fiske had it taken down. Said it gave her the horrors. But 2 nights ago, the new man heard it ring again. Rope gone, wire cut clean, nothing left to move it. And still it rang." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You witnessed this?" "No, sir. I left that cursed house soon as my month was up. But there's talk in the village. Queer lights seen by the chapel, footsteps in the east wing. They say the lady walks." Holmes's eyes kindled with that bright light I knew too well. "And do you, Mr. Pratt, believe such tales?" The man crossed himself hastily. "I don't know what to believe, sir, only that I won't set foot there again." When he had gone, Holmes turned to me with quiet satisfaction. "You see, Watson, how quickly superstition grows in soil prepared by fear. Yet even the wildest rumor often springs from a seed of fact. A bell that rings without mechanism, a letter that speaks of knowledge concealed. The game, I think, begins anew." The Hand of the Dead. That evening Holmes spread upon the table the sketches and notes he had made at Ravenshade. Among them was the crude diagram of the bell wires, the study, and the undercroft. He studied it for some time in silence. "At the inquest," he said at last, We concluded that Graves's hand still clutching the wire was the natural posture of death. But suppose, Watson, that his hand did not grasp it, that it was bound to it afterward. Bound by whom? By one who wished to hide a crime behind an accident. Recall the small loop of cord I remarked near the wrist. At the time I attributed it to the recoil of the wire, but the knot was deliberate, a sailor's hitch, uncommon in a servant's hand. Now consider the new man's tale, a bell that rings though the wire is cut. There is no mystery in physics, only in men. Someone alive at Ravenshade wishes to make the dead speak again. I stared at him. You mean? I mean that either the dead have learned the electrician's trade or one among the living prophets by their illusion. He tapped the anonymous letter, and our correspondent invites us to witness the performance. He smiled grimly. I have never yet refused an invitation from the unknown. The journey north. Once more. We left London 2 days later under a sky of iron clouds. Holmes had insisted that we travel lightly. For a ghost, Watson, seldom waits upon luggage. The journey passed in near silence. I knew better than to interrupt the current of his thought when it ran so deep. As dusk fell, the familiar silhouette of Ravenshade rose once more against the northern sky. It looked darker than before, its chimneys mere black stumps against the fading light. A single window showed a flicker of movement. Mrs. Fiske received us with evident surprise. Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, you cannot mean to stay here again? Only for a night, madam, Holmes replied smoothly. I have reason to believe the matter of your late husband's death is not yet entirely closed. Her face went white. Surely you do not— I accuse no one, said Holmes, but you will oblige me by allowing us access once more to the study and the undercroft. The safety of your household may depend upon it. Reluctantly she consented. The servants had fled days before, and the house felt emptier than ever. A faint wind moved through the corridors, carrying with it the distant sound of the chapel bell, a sound that set even my stout heart beating faster. The bell at midnight. It was close upon midnight when we resumed our vigil in the study. The rope of the bell had indeed been removed, leaving only the brass fitting above the mantel. Holmes sat in silence, his eyes upon the empty socket where the wire had been. Watson, he said softly, if you should hear anything, any sound whatever, note its direction, but do not move until I speak. Minutes passed. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of the fire. Then, without warning, the silence was cleft by a single sharp clang, the unmistakable note of the study bell. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. The undercroft, Watson! Quickly! We hurried through the panel, down the stair. The vault was as before, save that the wall where we had found Graves's body now stood open. A thin wire, newly fitted, ran from the cavity upward toward the floor above. Holmes traced it with his lantern, his expression grim. Reconnected, he murmured, and by a hand that knows the mechanism well. But whose? A sound behind us made me turn. Mrs. Fiske stood in the doorway, pale as death, a lamp trembling in her grasp. I heard it too, she whispered. The bell. It called to me. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon her, keen and compassionate. Yes, madam, he said quietly, and you obeyed its summons, as you have done before. Her eyes widened. You think I— He held up a hand. No accusation, only truth. You could not bear the thought that your husband's sin should die with him. You returned here to ring the bell, to make others believe his ghost walked, that his guilt might be forgotten in fear. But someone else has taken up your masquerade, someone who wishes you silent, as Sir Algernon wished his sister. The lamp in her hand flickered. Who then? She whispered. Holmes bent and lifted from the dust a torn scrap of cloth, black, coarse, and edged with white piping. The uniform of a butler, Watson. Mr. Pratt has been nearer to his former service than he would admit. He turned to Mrs. Fiske. You must leave this place tonight. Before the next bell rings there will be danger. As if in answer, the faint clang sounded again above us, slow, deliberate, and chilling. Holmes's eyes met mine. "Watson," he said, "our friend the butler is not done with Ravenshade, and before the dawn breaks we shall learn whether he serves the dead, or only himself." Chapter 8. The Butler's Shadow. The air beneath Ravenshade that night was colder than the grave. Holmes and I stood within the vault, our lanterns hooded, the flicker of their light breathing against the damp walls like the heartbeat of the earth itself. From above, through yards of stone and timber, came the faint creaks and sighs of the great house settling into its midnight stillness. Outside, the wind prowled among the chimneys, and the moon, a thin spectral blade, hung low above the moor. Holmes, crouched by the junction of the bell wires, spoke in a whisper that seemed to slice the dark cleanly in two. "Watson," he said, "we shall have our quarry tonight. There is no better snare than superstition, and our adversary has baited himself." I leaned close. "You are certain Pratt is behind it?" "As certain as one may be of a shadow," he replied. "Consider the facts. He alone possessed knowledge of the mechanism. He alone remained at Ravenshade after Sir Algernon's death, and he alone sought me out in London with a story designed to draw me back here. That was his first error." I frowned. "And his motive?" Holmes's pale eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "Greed, my dear fellow, dressed in the rags of fear. There was a codicil to Sir Algernon's will, witnessed by Greaves and the local solicitor, naming the butler as beneficiary of a considerable annuity, contingent upon his continued service. But Greaves died, and with him the witness. If Pratt could convince Mrs. Fiske that Ravenshade was haunted, unfit for habitation, she would seal the estate and settle the staff's claims to be rid of it. Pratt would receive his inheritance under the guise of loyalty. I stared. Then the bell, the apparitions, all of it was his contrivance. Holmes nodded. He merely exploited the house's existing infamy. A simple electrical attachment to the bell mechanism was sufficient to reproduce its ring from any point along the servants' corridor. The reconnected wire we discovered tonight completes the circuit. Observe. He reached up and touched the wire with the tip of his cane. A faint spark leapt, followed by a distant muffled clang from the study above. "The ghosts of Ravenshade," he murmured, "are very modern creatures." The trap is set. We extinguished our lanterns and took position behind the overturned barrels near the wall. Holmes drew from his coat a small revolver, which he examined with calm precision. "I prefer reason to violence," he said, "but one must occasionally reason in a language even scoundrels understand." The minutes dragged by. Somewhere above, a shutter banged in the wind. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, descending the hidden stair. The faint glow of a lantern preceded the figure that emerged into the vault. A broad-shouldered man in dark livery. Jonas Pratt. He moved with the stealth of a practiced thief, pausing now and then to listen. His lantern's beam swept across the stone floor, glinting on the very wire Holmes had mended earlier that night. Satisfied, he knelt and reached into his coat. I could see, even at that distance, the coil of additional wire in his hand. He was fastening it to the mechanism when Holmes rose, silent as a cat, and the circle of his lantern fell full upon the man's face. "Good evening, Mr. Pratt," he said evenly. "A curious hour for electrical maintenance." The butler leapt to his feet, the color draining from his cheeks. "Mr. Holmes? You've no right." "I have every right," Holmes interrupted. "You stand upon the scene of 2 deaths and a dozen lies. Shall I enumerate them?" Pratt's eyes darted toward the stair. "You can prove nothing." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "your handiwork proves itself. That coil in your hand connects the undercroft to the chapel bell. It was you who reattached the wire to create last night's haunting. You sought to drive Mrs. Fiske from the house and recover the fortune promised to you in a will no court would honor." The man gave a harsh laugh. "And if I did? The master owed me more than wages. I kept his secrets, and hers, longer than either deserved. He made me his accomplice, forced me to feed that madwoman below like an animal. And when he died, what was left for me? Nothing but whispers and ghosts. Holmes's voice was like a blade drawn from its sheath. Then you decided to create a ghost of your own, one that would serve you as faithfully as you once served him. You tampered with the mechanism, killed Graves when he tried to prevent you, and left his body where discovery would suggest accident. Pratt's hand went to his pocket. Holmes moved like lightning. There was a flash, a shout, and I fired instinctively. The report thundered through the vault, and the butler crumpled against the wall, the pistol slipping from his grasp. Holmes was beside him in an instant, kneeling, examining the wound. "Through the shoulder," he said. "You've winged him neatly, Watson. A month's rest in Durham jail will mend him." The man glared up at us through pain and hatred. "You think you finished it, don't you? But you can't bury what's in that house. The bell'll ring till Judgment Day." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Nonsense. I shall take great pleasure in dismantling the device myself." The broken bell. We escorted Pratt up the narrow stair to the study, where Holmes at once set to work upon the bell mechanism. With swift, deft movements he unwound the wire, removed the hidden battery, and dropped the apparatus into the hearth. It hissed and spat as the flames consumed it. "There," he said quietly. "The last voice of Ravenshade's madness is silenced." Mrs. Fiske, summoned by the commotion, appeared at the door. Her eyes widened at the sight of the wounded man. "Mr. Holmes? The living are sometimes more dangerous than the dead," Holmes said gravely. "This man sought to profit by your terror. The ghost has been laid to rest, madam, both literally and figuratively." She pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "Then it is truly over." "For Ravenshade, yes," Holmes replied. "But for Mr. Pratt, the law has yet to speak." Return to the light. By the time we handed our prisoner to the constables in Bishop Auckland, dawn had begun to spread its pale light across the hills. Holmes stood at the station platform, gazing eastward, the smoke of the departing train curling about him. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last. "Each time I believe I have plumbed the depths of human folly, someone presents me with a new abyss. Here was a man so long habituated to servitude that he could conceive of no liberty save through deceit. He made himself master only to become murderer. And Mrs. Fiske asked, "She will sell the estate and vanish, as she should. Ravenshade's story will sink, unrecorded, into local legend. I imagine within a decade they will speak of it as a haunting rather than a crime, which is after all a kind of mercy." He smiled faintly. "You will set it down otherwise, of course, and doubtless make me sound wiser than I am." I returned the smile. "If I do, Holmes, it is because you are the only man I have known who sees into the soul of silence itself." Holmes drew on his gloves. "Then let us leave silence behind, my dear fellow. London awaits, and I fancy the violin will sound doubly sweet after so much stillness." As the train pulled away, I looked back once more at the fading line of the northern hills. Somewhere beneath them, the broken bell of Ravenshade lay buried amid ash and stone. Yet in my mind I could still hear its faint echo, a single chime that spoke, not of fear or guilt, but of the strange, sorrowful music of truth uncovered. Chapter 9. The Return of the Violin. The London fog had reclaimed us. It hung in the streets like a patient beast, coiling about the lampposts and softening the harsh edges of the waking city. It was 3 days since we had left the bleak hills of Durham behind us, and the case of Ravenshade Hall, at least in the eyes of the public, was already sinking into the sediment of forgotten crimes. Holmes, however, had not yet dismissed it from the theatre of his mind. He sat by the fire at Baker Street that evening, the bow of his violin poised between his fingers, the instrument itself lying idle across his knees. The lamplight glinted upon the polished wood, but his eyes were turned inward, seeing not the instrument but the ghost of a pattern, still forming in his thoughts. I had long ago learned to let him brood in silence at such times, and contented myself with the evening paper. Yet after a while, the weight of that stillness pressed upon me, and I ventured a remark. "You appear unsatisfied, Holmes. Surely the case was brought to a conclusive end. Pratt's guilt is beyond question. Mrs. Fiske is safe, and the mysteries of Ravenshade are dispelled." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Are they, Watson? One may silence a bell, but its echo may yet wander in the air. Consider, 2 deaths by misadventure, 1 by madness, and a survivor whose silence is less peace than exhaustion. There are chords in that affair that still vibrate in my ear." He rose abruptly, crossed to the window, and stood gazing down upon Baker Street. The tragedy of Ravenshade was not born of greed alone, but of guilt. A guilt buried so long that when it stirred it took the shape of sound. I wonder sometimes how many such haunted houses stand across England. How many families build their fortunes on secrets that toll, unheard beneath their parlors. He turned suddenly. "And you, Watson, what melody do you hear in it?" "Melody?" I repeated. "Yes, melody. Every crime has its rhythm, its tempo of passion and remorse. The murders of envy move in quick time, those of hatred in violent crescendo. But Ravenshade—" He lifted the violin and plucked a single string, soft and hollow. "Ravenshade was adagio, slow, inevitable, mournful. It was not born of evil, but of decay." I could not help but smile. "You grow poetic, Holmes. Next you'll be composing a requiem for the criminal classes." He laughed softly, that rare human sound which I prized more than I ever told him. "A requiem, perhaps, but not for criminals, rather for their victims, who are often one and the same." He drew the bow across the strings then, and a low, sorrowful note filled the room. It trembled, hovered, and died. At that moment there came a knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter upon a tray. "This just arrived, sir, delivered by hand. The messenger said it was from the north." Holmes took it with a glance of curiosity. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably feminine. He broke the seal and read in silence. His expression changed from indifference to surprise, then softened into something like pity. He handed the letter to me without a word. "Mr. Holmes, I am shortly to leave England for the Continent. Before I go, I would have you know that Ravenshade is no more. The house burned 3 nights past. The villagers believe it an act of Providence. I do not contradict them. Among the ashes, the constables found something I think you may wish to see. It is enclosed herewith. May your genius be kinder to you than my conscience has been to me." Amelia Fiske. Pasted to the letter was a small scrap of blackened metal, twisted and warped. Holmes examined it under the lamplight, turning it gently between his fingers. "The tongue of the bell," he murmured, the only part that could still sound. He set it upon the mantelpiece beside the Persian slipper that held his tobacco. "So ends Ravenshade. Fire, the oldest and most impartial of judges, has pronounced sentence." A visitor in the fog. We spoke little more that evening. Holmes played for some time, his music wandering between melancholy and meditation. At last, when the clock marked 11:30, he laid the violin aside and reached for his pipe. "Strange, Watson," he said quietly. "Even in destruction the place seems restless. I wonder if Mrs. Fiske truly believes herself free of it." I was about to reply when there came again a knock at the door, soft, hesitant. Mrs. Hudson appeared, looking slightly discomposed. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a gentleman to see you. Says it's about the Ravenshade affair." "Show him up," said Holmes at once. A moment later a tall man entered. He was dressed in mourning, his face lean and pale. His eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Holmes. "My name is Henry Fiske," he said, "brother to the late Sir Algernon. I have come from the north." Holmes motioned him to a seat. "Pray sit down, Mr. Fiske. We have heard nothing of you before now. You have news?" The man hesitated. I learned of my brother's death only after your inquiry was concluded. The solicitor in Durham wrote to me abroad. But there is something you did not find, something that lies deeper than the vaults." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You have my full attention. My brother," the man continued, "was not mad, as the world believes. He was afraid of a crime we both committed long ago." He drew from his coat a small sealed envelope, yellow with age. "This, Mr. Holmes, was written by my hand 20 years past. Within it is the reason my brother hid our sister beneath that roof. You alone should read it, for I lack the courage to do so again." He placed the envelope upon the table and rose. "When you have read it, you will understand why I cannot stay in England." Without another word he turned and left. The door closed softly behind him. For a long moment Holmes sat motionless. Then he took up the envelope, broke the brittle seal, and unfolded the single page within. His brows drew together as he read. When at last he spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "Good heavens, Watson! The whole family was complicit. The sister, Margaret, was no lunatic at all. She discovered that their father's fortune had been built on forged deeds. When she threatened to expose them, the brothers confined her under the pretense of madness. Sir Algernon repented too late. His guilt drove him to obsession. Henry fled abroad and left her there. I felt my throat tighten. Then all her suffering, all her silence was for the sake of their wealth." "Yes," said Holmes softly, "the silence of the innocent to protect the guilty. It is a theme as old as Cain." He refolded the letter carefully and placed it within his dispatch box. "This, Watson, must remain between us. The law has already taken enough from that wretched family." The music of closure. He returned to the violin once more. The notes that rose then were unlike any I had heard from him before, neither mournful nor triumphant, but strangely serene, as though the instrument itself offered absolution. When the final chord faded, Holmes laid the bow aside and looked into the fire. "Do you know, Watson," he said quietly, "I sometimes think the truest mysteries are not those we solve, but those we choose to leave unsolved. There is mercy in ignorance." He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "And yet I shall always hear that bell, softly at the edge of thought, reminding me that silence too can speak." Outside, the fog pressed close against the windows, muffling the world to a hush. Within the room, the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of Holmes's breathing, a music as constant and as mysterious as the heart of London itself. Chapter V. The Whispering Ashes. It was some weeks later, during one of those damp, indeterminate February evenings when London seems to sink beneath its own fog, that the Ravenshade affair returned to us once more. Quietly, like a voice from a dream, I had thought the case at an end. Mrs. Fiske was abroad, Pratt's trial had concluded with a sentence of penal servitude, and Holmes had resumed his old rhythm of study and solitude. The violin once more sang in our sitting-room, the tobacco smoke curled again through the lamplight, and the shadow of that northern house had begun, at last, to fade. But fate, as I have learned through long acquaintance with my friend, has an unkind habit of knocking twice. That evening found Holmes deep in one of his chemical investigations, surrounded by retorts and glass vials. The air was thick with the smell of sulphur and heated iron. I was attempting to lose myself in a medical monograph when the sharp rap of the knocker startled us both. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram on a salver. Holmes tore it open, read the brief message, and gave a low whistle. From Inspector Lestrade, Durham Constabulary. Ruins of Ravenshade yielded human remains, not matching previous burials. Request your presence. Holmes rose at once. Watson, it seems the ashes have found their voice. The journey to the north. Our journey to Durham was a somber one. The countryside lay sodden under a low, oppressive sky, the hedgerows skeletal, the earth bruised by frost. As we neared the station, Holmes spoke for the first time in hours. "I had expected as much," he said quietly. Fire purifies, but it also reveals. Someone, perhaps Pratt, perhaps another, had reason to bury more than guilt beneath that house. Lestrade awaited us at the inn near Ravenshade's remains. The good inspector's face was ruddy with the cold, his manner brisk as ever, but I detected unease beneath his official composure. "A queer business, Mr. Holmes," he began. "The place is gutted from cellar to roof, but one of my men found a charred door leading off from the undercroft. Behind it, a bricked-up chamber. Inside bones. 2, possibly 3 persons. I'd have sworn we had all the bodies accounted for." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Show me." "The ruins of Ravenshade." Ravenshade Hall, what remained of it, stood like a blackened skeleton against the sky. The great chimneys were toppled, the walls half collapsed, and the frost lay thick upon the scorched stones. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, a mingling of ruin and rebirth. Lestrade led us through the remains of the study, now open to the sky, and down the half-fallen stair to the undercroft. There, beyond the chamber where graves had been found, a new passage yawned, the mortar fresh where rescuers had broken through. Holmes entered first, his lantern casting long, quivering shadows. The chamber beyond was narrow, lined with rough stone, and filled knee-deep with ash. Near the far wall, partly embedded in the debris, lay the skeletons Lestrade had spoken of. Holmes crouched beside them, silent for a long while. Then, with infinite care, he lifted from the ashes a small, half-melted object, a signet ring. He cleaned it upon his sleeve, and the firelight caught the faint engraving of a coat of arms. "The Fisk crest," he murmured. "But note, there are 2 rings here, not one. One bears the initials H.F. I gasped. "Henry Fisk." Holmes's expression darkened. "Just so. It appears our penitent traveller never reached the continent after all." Lestrade bent closer. "You think he returned to the hall?" "I think," said Holmes quietly, "that remorse is a heavier chain than any the law can forge. He came to bury the evidence of his family's sins, and perished for his trouble." He turned one of the skulls gently. "These bones are not Henry's alone. Here are the remains of a woman. The stature and age suggest Mrs. Amelia Fisk." "Good Lord!" I cried. "Then she—" Holmes nodded. "Returned, perhaps, to finish what fire began. She and Henry Fisk, bound at last in their shared guilt. It seems the past of Ravenshade devoured all who sought to master it. The final clue." As he spoke, his eye caught something glinting faintly amid the ashes. He reached down and drew forth a sliver of glass, no larger than a sovereign, its surface blackened but not broken. Holding it to the lantern, he smiled grimly. "A mirror fragment," he said. "From the drawing-room above, no doubt. Do you recall, Watson, the portrait that hung there, the one Mrs. Fisk claimed was herself as a girl? I wager the frame concealed a mirror behind the canvas. It was there, not in conscience alone, that she saw her reflection and found herself wanting. When she returned to the ruins, that mirror greeted her again, and I fear she mistook its silence for forgiveness." He dropped the shard gently back among the ashes. "There is poetry in the ruin of such lives, Watson, but it is a dark verse indeed." Lestrade cleared his throat. "So you'll call this a case of accident, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes shook his head. "Call it what you like, Inspector. The law has no name for self-destruction by remorse. The ashes speak." When we emerged from the ruins, the wind had risen, carrying with it the faint chime of metal striking stone. I turned, startled, but Holmes only smiled faintly. "The bell," he said. "A remnant of wire in the rubble, perhaps. Yet I confess, Watson, there is something curiously fitting in it. Ravenshade will not be quiet until every echo of its folly is spent." He drew his coat about him. "Come, my dear fellow. London calls us back to life. Let the dead whisper to the wind. They have earned their voice at last." As we turned down the road toward the waiting carriage, I looked back once more. The broken silhouette of Ravenshade Hall loomed against the horizon, the grey sky bleeding into the high sea, charred ruins. And in that moment, though it may have been no more than fancy, I thought I heard faint and clear across the moor a single bell note carried on the wind, not the sound of warning nor of fear, but of release. Holmes paused beside me, his gaze distant, his features softened by something almost like reverence. "Yes," he said quietly, "even the ashes speak, Watson. But not all who listen understand their language." And with that he turned his face toward London and the living, while behind us the last secret of Ravenshade settled into silence forever. Chapter the 15th. The Case of the Burned Letter. The weeks that followed our return from the north passed in that curious quiet which always settles after a great case. The stillness of the stage once the curtain has fallen, when even applause has faded into memory. Holmes resumed his experiments, alternating between chemical research and the occasional trifling inquiry from Scotland Yard, though none seemed to rouse in him that fierce intellectual flame which had burned so steadily through the Ravenshade affair. It was upon an unseasonably warm March morning that the first faint echo of that case stirred again. I had just returned from my surgery in Kensington when I found Holmes at the breakfast table, the remains of coffee and a half-consumed egg before him, and a telegram spread across the cloth like a battlefield dispatch. His expression was one I knew well, a mixture of irritation and delight. "Watson," said he, tapping the paper with his long finger, "the dead are once more troubling the living. Lestrade requests our immediate presence at Scotland Yard, a matter concerning a certain letter found among the archives of the Durham Constabulary." I looked at him in astonishment. "Surely, Holmes, that case is finished. The house is ashes, the culprit's dead or imprisoned." He interrupted. "If human guilt could be burned away as easily as timber, the world would be a purer place. But no, my dear fellow, it seems one ember yet smoulders. We must go and see what spark remains." The summons to Scotland Yard. Lestrade received us with his usual brisk civility, though I fancied there was something of embarrassment beneath his manner. Upon his desk lay a small parcel, sealed with the official stamp of the constabulary. "Here it is, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Came to light 2 days ago when they were clearing out the evidence room in Durham. Looks harmless enough, but the sergeant who found it swears it wasn't there before. The record shows no entry. It was wrapped in oilcloth and wedged behind a beam in the case files. Thought you'd best see it." Holmes opened the parcel with delicate precision. Inside lay a bundle of blackened paper, half-charred, brittle with age. Only a few lines of writing were legible on the topmost sheet. He read them aloud slowly, each word falling like a stone into the silence of the office. "To my brother Henry, if this reaches you, then the truth has survived me. I can no longer bear the sound of that bell. It rings for both of us, for what we did and what she knew. The fire will cleanse nothing. It will only summon her voice." A.F. Holmes's brows knit. "You see, Watson, the initials again. A.F. Algernon Fisk. But what truth does he refer to? The confession already revealed by Henry's letter?" Lestrade shrugged. "That's just it. The rest of the letter's burned away. Nothing but cinders. Still, it's queer, isn't it, that it should turn up now, weeks after the fire and hundreds of miles from the scene." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he turned the fragments over one by one, studying the pattern of the scorch marks with the intensity of a man deciphering an ancient code. "Not burned in the fire," he murmured. "See here. The edges are uneven, the ink melted in streaks rather than flakes. These pages were scorched by lamp oil, not by open flame. Someone attempted to destroy them hastily and then hid what remained. Lestrade, when you say the file was sealed, who had access to that room?" "Only the clerk of records, sir. Fellow named Murchison. Been there 15 years. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Then we must pay Mr. Murchison a visit." The keeper of the records. The record clerk proved to be a nervous, spindle-legged man of middle age, whose spectacles magnified a pair of eyes already too large for his pale face. He received us in a small chamber lined with dusty ledgers. "Yes, yes, of course," he stammered when questioned. "I was the one who found it." Cleaning the shelf I was, and there it lay. Can't imagine how it came there, unless someone slipped it in before the fire. We've had odd visitors now and then, researchers and journalists asking after the Ravenshade case. Holmes fixed him with that piercing gaze which few could withstand. And who, precisely, came last? The clerk hesitated. A woman, sir, about a fortnight ago. Tall, well-dressed, though her veil was heavy, said she was writing a paper on local history. The Fisk family, she mentioned. She spent an hour or more in the archives, said she'd lost a cousin in the fire. I thought no harm of it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A fortnight ago, you say? And she signed the register? Yes, sir, though only as Mrs. Armitage. I took it for her married name. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you, Mr. Murchison. You have been of great service. The woman in the veil. Once outside, Holmes drew me aside. Watson, the game stirs again. A woman, tall, veiled, and seeking knowledge of the Fisk family. At the very archive where a letter appears as if by conjuring. Mrs. Armitage is, I think, a pseudonym, and the only woman who might still profit from the secrets of Ravenshade. Good heavens! I breathed. Margaret Fisk? The very same, if indeed she is, dead. I stared at him. Holmes, we saw her die. So we believed. But recall, Watson, there was no examination, no official record, only our own observation by lamplight and haste. What if that body was not hers? The fire destroyed all trace. The medical report was perfunctory. Suppose our silent servant had a pupil, someone who learned the art of hiding in plain sight. His voice dropped to a whisper. The silent servant may have taught his mistress too well. The burned truth. We returned to Baker Street that night under a lowering sky, the lamps hissing in the drizzle. Holmes placed the fragments of the letter upon the table, arranging them with tweezers like pieces of a puzzle. Observe the pattern, Watson, he said. The lower corner bears the imprint of a seal, faint but distinct. Not the Fisk crest, but the initials MF pressed in wax. Margaret Fisk, not Algernon. The letter was written by the sister. Not to Henry, but to her brother before the fire. This was her confession, not his. He leaned back, his eyes shining with that cold fire of comprehension. She lived, Watson. She survived the house, the cell, perhaps even the madness, and now she seeks to rewrite her family's story from the shadows. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. Then she may still be out there. Holmes nodded slowly. Somewhere. Watching, and perhaps waiting for the last voice of Ravenshade to fall silent. He gathered the burned pages into a folder and locked them in his desk. Then, with that air of quiet finality I knew so well, he said, Let the yard pursue its ghosts, Watson. For my part, I prefer the living, though, I confess, there are times when the two are perilously alike. He took up his violin once more, and the first low note rose, solemn, searching, unresolved, as though the strings themselves mourned a truth too heavy to bear. Outside, the London rain began to fall in earnest, washing the city clean, or so it seemed, yet carrying with it, for those who listened closely, the faintest echo of a bell that would not quite die. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Spoke in Silence. Spring came late to London that year. The rains hung on, and even the blossoms in Regent's Park seemed to open reluctantly, as if the air itself still carried the chill of ghosts. It was in the first week of April when the final act of the Ravenshade affair began, quietly, as all truly perilous things begin. Holmes had been uncommonly idle. For days he sat by the window, pipe in hand, watching the drift of carriages along Baker Street with that inscrutable patience which, in him, was often the prelude to sudden action. His violin lay neglected upon its stand. His chemical retorts were cold. The burned letter from Durham, the last voice of the Fisk family, remained locked in his desk, though I had observed him more than once glance toward it as if it whispered still. On that morning, the bells of Marylebone struck 10. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. From Reverend Josiah Grieve, Prior of St. Anne's Abbey, Northumberland. A woman here seeking refuge under name Mrs. Armitage. Behavior strange, speech incoherent. Claims acquaintance with you. I beg your counsel." He looked up sharply, his grey eyes bright with that old light. "Watson, the game is afoot once more." The road to St. Anne's. By evening we were bound northward again, the great express rolling through the deepening twilight. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his gaze fixed upon the shifting reflections in the carriage window. "Holmes," I ventured, "you truly believe this woman to be Margaret Fiske?" "I believe," he replied, "that the past seldom dies in isolation. Ravenshade was not a single crime, Watson, but a contagion, and contagions have a habit of spreading until the last living carrier is found. Whether this woman is its victim or its vector remains to be seen." The journey ended at a lonely station upon the moor. The abbey lay 2 miles distant, a grey spire rising from the mist, surrounded by stunted yews. Its bells tolled faintly across the valley as we approached, echoing with uncanny resonance against the cliffs. Reverend Grieve received us in the cloistered courtyard, a small man of scholarly aspect, his face creased with worry. "You have come swiftly, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I thank you. The woman arrived 3 nights ago, half dead with exhaustion. She begged shelter, saying she was hunted. Since then she has spoken little, but last night she called your name, and muttered something of fire and silence." Holmes's face betrayed no emotion. "You have seen her today?" "Yes. She is in the infirmary, under the care of our sister nurse. But, Mr. Holmes, there is something I must tell you. This morning we found a letter upon her pillow. It was addressed to you." He produced a small folded paper, its edges frayed, the handwriting unmistakably feminine and steady despite its tremor. Holmes read in silence, then handed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, you were right. The house was not done with me. I escaped the fire because I wished to die in my own time, not by my brother's guilt. I have lived these years under borrowed names, listening to the echo of that bell. It rings still, but not in Ravenshade. It rings in my mind. If you come, you will find the truth I withheld. After that I shall speak no more." M.F. Holmes folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. "Take me to her." The woman in the cell. The infirmary was a bare chamber lit by a single lamp. Upon the narrow bed lay a woman wrapped in a grey shawl, her hair streaked with white, though her face was scarcely past middle age. Her eyes opened as we entered, and for an instant, just an instant, I thought I saw recognition flare there, followed by that strange composure, which marks those who have nothing left to lose. "Mr. Holmes?" she whispered. Her voice, though faint, carried the tone of one long accustomed to command. Holmes approached and bowed slightly. "Miss Fiske, if I may still call you that." "I am no one's sister now," she said. "The fire burned that name away." There was a long pause. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the window. "I am told," said Holmes softly, "that you sought to see me. You spoke of a truth withheld." She turned her gaze toward him. "You were right about my brothers. They built their fortune upon deceit. But you did not know the whole of it. I was not their prisoner, Mr. Holmes. I was their accomplice." Holmes said nothing, but I saw his fingers tighten upon the bedpost. She continued, her voice steadier now. "It was I who discovered the forgeries, and I who first suggested silence. Algernon was weak, Henry fearful. We buried our shame together, and for a time it served us. But guilt breeds possession. Algernon heard voices, Henry dreamed of fire, and I—" She shuddered. I began to hear the bell. Her eyes met Holmes's with sudden clarity. "It was never real, you see, the bell. It was the sound of our own deceit tolling in the mind. But Graves believed it, and so the lie became flesh. He died for it. I let him die." Holmes's voice, when it came, was grave but gentle. "And when the fire consumed Ravenshade?" "I set it," she said simply, "to cleanse what we had built. But I failed. I lived, and so did the truth. That is why I came here, to end the sound. Then you must let the living silence it for you, said Holmes quietly. You have spoken now. Confession is a form of absolution. A faint smile crossed her lips. No, Mr. Holmes, not confession. Completion. There is still one thing you have not seen. She reached beneath the pillow and drew forth a small charred envelope, its seal broken. This, she said, was meant for you before the fire. Read it when I am gone. Before either of us could speak, her hand fell slack. Her eyes, open still, stared at something far beyond the vaulted ceiling. The faintest echo of breath escaped her lips, and then she was still. The last letter. Holmes stood in silence for a long while, then turned to the lamp and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the writing faint and scorched but legible. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes. If ever you find this, know that Ravenshade was not a house but a curse, built upon silence and the fear of truth. The bell was our own making, the sound of denial given shape. You who seek truth above all will understand that some truths are not to be spoken but endured. Burn this letter when you have read it. Let the silence rest. Margaret Fisk. Holmes folded the letter carefully, then without hesitation held it to the lamp flame. We watched in silence as the paper curled, blackened, and vanished into a wisp of smoke. He turned to me, his face pale but composed. The silence she spoke of, Watson, is not absence of sound. It is peace. I think we may let it stand. As we left the abbey, the dawn was breaking, a thin ribbon of light upon the moor, pale and uncertain, but growing stronger with every step. Holmes paused at the gate and looked back toward the distant spire. For once, he said quietly, I find no pleasure in solving a mystery. There are cases, Watson, that end not with triumph, but with understanding. This was one of them. He drew his coat about him and set his face toward the rising sun. Come, my dear fellow. The world still holds its share of puzzles, and I have no wish to linger among the dead. We walked down the long road toward the station, the wind carrying behind us the soft, solemn toll of the abbey bell, not of warning this time, nor of guilt, but of release. And thus ended the case of the silent servant, a tale of sound and silence, of sins buried and unearthed, and of one woman's final voice carried not by the bell of Ravenshade, but by the truth she could at last no longer keep. Chapter 3. The Casebook Entry. It was some months later that I at last found the peace to write this final entry, the conclusion to what Holmes himself once termed the saddest case of our long companionship. London, that tireless heart of civilization, had already swallowed the story of Ravenshade whole. In the city's newspapers its ruins became a curiosity, its tragedy a paragraph, and its survivors. There were none. Only Holmes and I, who had walked through the ashes, knew that the true ruins were not of stone, but of conscience. The affair might easily have slipped into the recesses of memory, had not Holmes one evening drawn from his drawer a small, leather-bound volume, the Casebook of Unrecorded Matters. Upon the first page, written in his precise hand, he inscribed, "The Case of the Silent Servant, concluded April 1890. A study in guilt and in the strange eloquence of silence." He closed the book gently and leaned back in his chair. "Watson," he said, "I have been thinking of that woman, Margaret Fisk. There was in her something curiously noble, though born of ruin. She sought truth only when it could no longer serve her. That is a failing shared by half the world." "You pity her?" I asked. He looked into the fire. "I understand her. There is a moment, my dear fellow, when the mind recoils upon itself, when the intellect becomes both judge and executioner. She reached that point long before we met her. I merely recorded the verdict." He rose, crossed to the mantel, and took up the small relic that still rested there, the twisted fragment of the bell's tongue. It had blackened further with age, its metal dull and rough. "You see this scrap of iron, Watson? It was once the voice of Ravenshade, but remove its bell, and it is mute metal once more. Harmless, forgotten. So it is with guilt. Only when struck by memory does it sound again. He replaced it carefully. That, I think, is the moral of our affair, and perhaps of all human tragedy. A visitor from the yard. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a visiting card. Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, the law itself has come to see if the world still contains mysteries. Lestrade entered, his boots damp from rain, his manner unusually subdued. Good evening, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. He removed his hat and coughed discreetly. I thought I'd bring you something you might want to keep. From his coat he produced a small packet, neatly sealed in brown paper. Inside lay a charred scrap of parchment, bearing only 2 words in faded ink. Forgive me. It was found, said Lestrade, in the Abbey garden at St. Anne's when the sisters turned the soil for spring planting. Must have been blown there by the wind. They thought it best sent to you. Holmes regarded the fragment for a long time before placing it beside the bell tongue on the mantel. Thank you, Lestrade, he said softly. You have delivered the last note in a long and melancholy symphony. The inspector, evidently moved though unwilling to show it, took his leave soon after. When he had gone, Holmes stood a while in silence, then spoke almost to himself. It is an odd thing, Watson. We pursue criminals, yet it is conscience that punishes them best. The law deals in proof, guilt deals in eternity. The last reflection. Later that night, as I wrote these lines, Holmes took up his violin. The melody that rose from it was low and contemplative, yet not sorrowful, rather the measured song of a mind finding rest after long disquiet. When he had finished, he turned to me with that rare gentleness which only those who knew him best would ever have recognized. You see, Watson, he said, there are crimes that end in punishment and others that end in silence. Of the two, I find the latter more complete. He smiled then, that quick fleeting smile that broke like sunlight upon his austere features. And perhaps it is well. The world is noisy enough without the bells of old ghosts disturbing its sleep. He drew the curtains against the night and settled once more into his chair. Outside, London's ceaseless rumble murmured like a distant sea, while within the fire burned low and steady. The case of the silent servant was over, not merely closed in fact, but resolved in spirit. As I laid down my pen, I reflected that, though the years would bring us other adventures, none would haunt me so quietly, or teach so much about the strange music of the human soul. For in that dark house in Durham, amid guilt and madness and the tolling of unseen bells, I had seen something even my brilliant friend could not quite define, the sound of truth itself, fading at last into peace. Chapter 14. Epilogue. The Bell in Baker Street. It was an autumn evening of that same year, and the yellow fog rolled thickly along Baker Street, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and turning the gas lamps to dim spheres of amber. The fire burned low upon our hearth. Holmes sat in his habitual chair, his lean features thrown into relief by the glow, while the smoke from his pipe hung about him like the aura of some thoughtful spirit. For once, all was peace. It had been months since our last serious case, and the affairs of Ravenshade, so grim, so human, had sunk, I thought, into the depths of memory. Holmes had spent the day in the reading room of the British Museum, consulting a monograph on acoustics. He had spoken little at dinner, and now, with the long fingers of one hand steepled beneath his chin, he seemed absorbed in meditation. At length I said, "You are unusually silent, Holmes. Is your mind upon music or upon murder?" He smiled faintly. "Upon both, my dear Watson. They are not so different. Each has its motifs, its repetitions, and its final, inevitable cadence." He rose then, crossed to the mantel, and lifted the small relic that had rested there since spring, the warped fragment of the bell's tongue from Ravenshade Hall. He turned it over thoughtfully in his fingers. "It is curious," he murmured, "how certain objects acquire a voice of their own. This scrap of metal, mute as it appears, speaks to me of pride, guilt, and retribution. There is philosophy in such relics, Watson. They remind one that the echo of human folly outlives the sound." He replaced it gently. "And yet," he added, "I sometimes fancy I still hear that bell when London is quietest." A knock at the door. Even as he spoke, there came a rap upon the door below. Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up the stair. "A parcel for you, Mr. Holmes. Special delivery." Holmes frowned slightly. "At this hour? Curious indeed. Be so good as to bring it up, Mrs. Hudson." She entered a moment later, bearing a small, well-wrapped box, scarcely larger than a man's hand, addressed in an unfamiliar but elegant hand, to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London, from the Reverend Josiah Grieve, St. Anne's Abbey, Northumberland. Holmes's eyes kindled with interest. Our quiet friend of the cloth. What could the good prior have to say to us now? He unwrapped the parcel with meticulous care. Inside lay a small wooden casket, its lid fastened by a single brass clasp. Upon opening it, we found, nestled within folds of linen, a bell, small, tarnished, but unmistakably the twin of that which had hung in Sir Algernon Fisk's study. For a long while neither of us spoke. Holmes lifted it delicately by its iron hoop, and gave it the faintest shake. The sound that issued was thin, almost ethereal. Not a ring, but a sigh. Attached to the handle was a folded note in Reverend Grieve's hand. "Mr. Holmes, during renovations to the Abbey crypt, workman, discovered this bell sealed within a niche, wrapped in the fragments of a woman's cloak. I thought it proper to forward it to you, who alone may know its meaning. There was no inscription save one scratched upon the metal. Silence ends in truth. Yours faithfully, Josiah Grieve Holmes." Laid the bell upon the table and stared at it as if it were some rare specimen. "So," he said softly, "the final voice of Ravenshade speaks again, not in menace, but in benediction." I bent closer. The words were there indeed, crudely scratched into the metal by a trembling hand. "Silence ends in truth." "Margaret Fisk's hand," said Holmes. "No other could have written those words, nor hidden the bell in consecrated ground. It was her last act, to lay to rest the symbol of her family's curse. How strange, Watson, that in seeking to destroy her own voice, she preserved it instead." He looked up suddenly, his expression softening. "There is something almost beautiful in it, don't you think? All her life she sought silence, and in the end she spoke the only words that mattered." Holmes's meditation. He stood a long while by the window, the fog drifting like ghostly lace beyond the glass. "There are cases, Watson, that end not with the criminal's capture, but with the world's forgiveness. This was one of them. I have pursued many men for their sins, but rarely have I seen a soul so punished by its own conscience. Margaret Fisk built her prison in the mind and perished within it." He smiled faintly, half to himself. "And yet she left us a creed fit for all who suffer under guilt. Silence ends in truth. There is your sermon for the age, Watson." "You almost sound like a moralist," I said with a laugh. "Almost," he admitted, returning to his chair. "But not quite. I am merely an observer. The moralist explains, I record." He took up his violin then, and as the first clear notes filled the room, the fog outside seemed to thin, as though the city itself paused to listen. The melody was gentle and slow, not the dirge of Ravenshade, but something lighter, freer, touched with compassion. When he had finished, he set the instrument aside. "There, my dear Watson, is your true epilogue. The living must play their music while they may. The dead have earned their rest." The final note. That night before retiring, I looked once more upon the little bell upon our mantel. The lamplight caught its worn surface, and for an instant it seemed almost to glow. Holmes had fallen asleep in his chair, his face composed, the shadow of that half-smile still upon his lips. The violin rested against his knee. I stepped softly to the hearth and laid another log upon the fire, As I did so, a faint metallic ting sounded from the bell, so soft that it might have been the settling of the metal, or merely my imagination. Yet Holmes's eyes opened at once. "Did you hear it, Watson?" he asked quietly. "I thought I did," I confessed. He nodded, closing his eyes again. "Then let it be. The last echo of Ravenshade. Let it rest." The firelight flickered, and outside the fog thickened once more over London. Within that small, familiar room, all was still, save for the faint hum of the city beyond, and the deep, even breathing of my friend. Thus ends the case of Sherlock Holmes and the Silent Servant, in which a bell tolled for guilt, for silence, and at last for peace. And though many years have passed since that evening in Baker Street, I have sometimes thought, in those quiet hours before dawn, that if one listens very closely, the world itself holds the faintest echo of that bell, not of warning, but of remembrance. Chapter 15, Postscript, the last casebook. It is in the twilight of one's years, when the noise of the world softens into the distance, that the past grows loud again. As I set pen to paper now, seated before the same fire that once burnt bright in Baker Street, I feel the old ghost stirring, not of malice, but of memory. Of all the chronicles I have written of my friend, the case of the Silent Servant remains the one that haunts me most quietly. The years have carried us both far from those strange days. The rooms at 2921B stand much as they always did. Holmes's worn chair, the Persian slipper that still holds his tobacco, the violin resting where the light from the window may catch it. Yet the man himself, that singular flame of reason, has long since withdrawn from the world's affairs. I see him but rarely now, tending his bees upon the Sussex downs, a figure as solitary and austere as any monastic scholar. When last I visited him, the sea lay calm and pewter grey beyond the cliffs. Holmes received me with his old courtesy, though his face bore the fine lines that come not from age, but from thought. We sat together upon the terrace as the bees moved gently among the clover, their hum strangely akin to the low, meditative murmur of the man beside me. "I see the world has not yet tired of you, Holmes," I said, for a parcel of new editions of my modest writings had just reached him. He smiled that rare, sardonic smile. "Nor you of it, my dear fellow. You have made me far more famous than I deserve, a myth in a deerstalker cap. Yet there are moments when I wonder whether all the cleverness in the world is not less valuable than a single act of mercy." I knew at once what memory stirred him. "You speak of Ravenshade?" He nodded. "Yes. There was something there that eluded even my reason. Not a fact, but a feeling. A recognition that intellect alone cannot heal what conscience has wounded. Margaret Fisk's tragedy was not of crime, but of silence. She mistook punishment for penance, as many do. The mind may solve mysteries, Watson, but it cannot absolve them." He looked out across the water. "I sometimes think," he continued softly, "that the great question of our age is not how men commit wrong, but how they learn to forgive it." I have long since ceased to be surprised by such reflections from Holmes. Beneath that cold exterior, so often mistaken for indifference, there lies a depth of compassion few ever perceive. He would deny it, of course, but I have seen it. In his gentleness to the guilty, in the way he speaks to the broken, and in the quiet sorrow that follows every solved case. The bell revisited. Before I left Sussex that day, I noticed upon the mantel of his little study a familiar object, a small tarnished bell, half covered in dust. "You kept it," I said. He turned it idly in his fingers. "Yes. I could not quite part with it. It reminds me that even silence may have its use. When the mind grows restless, I strike it once, and it brings me back to stillness. The sound fades quickly, but the quiet it leaves behind is profound." He set it down again and smiled. "It has not rung on its own, you see. I believe we may finally trust the dead to rest." I left him soon after. As I walked down the winding lane toward the station, the sea air in my lungs and the scent of heather on the breeze, I found myself reflecting on all that had passed since first I met him in that little room off Baker Street. The years had carried us through peril and triumph, through the bright puzzles of reason and the darker labyrinths of the soul. Yet it was the silent servant, more than any other case, that taught me the measure of my friend's humanity. Watson's closing reflection. It is easy, in recounting his adventures, to dwell upon the brilliance of his deductions, the swift unmasking of villains, the triumph of logic over mystery, but those who saw him only as the cold instrument of reason did not know him as I did. They did not see him in those quiet moments after a case was closed, standing by the window, violin in hand, his gaze far away, his thoughts not upon victory, but upon the frailty of those he had unmasked. Holmes once said to me, "The detective's trade, Watson, is not to prove guilt, but to uncover truth, and truth, like a bell, is indifferent to who strikes it." Those words have never left me. In the years since, I have often awakened in the small hours to the murmur of London outside my window, the distant roll of carriages fading into the fog, and at times, though reason tells me it is only the echo of my own heart, I fancy I hear again that faint metallic chime, a single note, clear and far away, ringing through the corridors of memory. It is not a sound of fear now, nor of guilt, but of remembrance. For though the bell of Ravenshade is long silent, its lesson endures. That truth, once spoken, brings peace not only to the dead, but to the living who bear witness to it. And so, as I close this account, I dedicate it not merely to the genius of my friend Sherlock Holmes, but to the humanity that lay, often hidden, beneath that keen grey gaze. May the world remember him not only as the mind that solved mysteries, but as the soul that understood silence. John H. Watson, M.D. London, 1896. Chapter 16. Editor's Note. A Lost Case Restored. Among the papers of the late Dr. John H. Watson, purchased at the estate sale of his niece, Miss Veronica Smallwood, there was discovered a bundle of handwritten folios bound together with twine, and marked in the doctor's unmistakable hand, "Not for publication." The Silent Servant. The manuscript lay hidden for over half a century in an old dispatch box bearing the faded label 221B Baker Street Private. Inside were the familiar elements of Watson's careful documentation: notes, telegrams, train schedules, even a faded scrap of newspaper reporting the destruction of Ravenshade Hall. Tucked between the pages, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small metallic fragment, the corroded tongue of a bell. No one who has read these pages could mistake the tone or authorship. It is the voice of Watson at his most humane and reflective, the loyal friend, the faithful chronicler, and in these last chapters the philosopher who had walked long enough beside genius to glimpse its solitude. Scholars may debate the veracity of the tale that follows. It bears none of the theatrical villainy of the Sign of Four, nor the adventure of the Hound of the Baskervilles. Its villain is conscience, its weapon silence. Yet in that very quietude lies the power of what is surely one of the most remarkable unpublished Holmes cases. The provenance of the manuscript. The papers appear to have been written between 1890 and 1896, the period following Holmes's partial retirement to Sussex. The handwriting of the closing chapter is shaky, the ink faded, a testament perhaps to the hand of a man grown old, revisiting the memories of youth. There is no record that Watson ever attempted to publish this narrative during his lifetime. Whether at Holmes's request or from his own sense of reverence, we cannot say. What may be said with confidence is that the events of The Silent Servant fit perfectly within the canon's chronology. References to the Northern Railway, to Lestrade's mid-career at the Yard, and to Watson's later practice in Kensington confirm the likely date. The tone, that mingling of awe, melancholy and admiration, suggests it was among the last of the Doctor's completed works. Holmes in reflection. If earlier adventures celebrated Holmes's intellect, The Silent Servant illuminates his heart. We see a man wearied not by crime, but by the moral noise of the world. A detective who, having untangled 1,000 lies, begins to discern the tragic music beneath them. Watson, ever his mirror, captures this evolution with the tenderness of one who has learned that friendship, too, is a kind of faith. Here, in the twilight of their companionship, we glimpse Holmes at his most human, mourning the futility of guilt, forgiving even the wicked, and finding in the quiet toll of a ruined bell the echo of truth itself. The relic of particular interest to collectors is the object found alongside the manuscript. The fragment of bell metal, roughly an inch in length, bears faint traces of an engraving visible only under magnification. Silence ends in truth. Experts have verified that the lettering is of late Victorian style, hand-carved with a fine chisel. Whether this is a prop preserved by Watson as a sentimental memento or an authentic artifact from the events at Ravensshade Hall cannot be determined with certainty. Publication note. The text is presented here with minimal correction. Archaic spellings have been retained where appropriate, and the narrative divisions correspond exactly to Watson's original headings. The closing paragraph, dated 1896, appears in a different ink, and may have been added during a later revision of his memoirs. Readers familiar with the canon will recognize subtle self-references. The tone of the Sussex vampire, the compassion of the veiled lodger, both stories which, it is now clear, drew emotional inspiration from this earlier, darker case. Closing words. As editor and custodian of Dr. Watson's legacy, I can add little to what he himself wrote save this. The case of the silent servant may be the most personal of all his accounts. It is not a tale of adventure, but of atonement, not of deduction, but of understanding. It reminds us that Sherlock Holmes, for all his brilliance, was not merely the world's greatest reasoning machine, but a man who learned, in his own austere fashion, that the deepest mysteries are those of the human heart. And somewhere, in a forgotten drawer perhaps, or a quiet Sussex study where the hum of bees replaces the ringing of bells, that tarnished fragment of metal may still rest, silent yet eloquent, waiting for the rare listener who can hear what Holmes once called the language of peace. Compiled and annotated by Edward Ashcroft, Fellow of the Royal Society of Antiquaries, London, 1937.